Hey everyone, glad you're back on Unspoken Fears. Today we're covering 11 of the most disturbing true Oregon horror stories ever sent in to this channel. Please subscribe, Unspoken Fears, turn the bell on. Let's get into it. The driftwood kept coming back. Mara had driven this stretch of Highway 101 twice before in her life, and both times she'd kept her eyes forward, past the turnoff for Tillicum Beach, past the gravel spur that dropped down toward the dune grass, and the gray Pacific beyond it. This third time, she almost missed the turn again, out of habit more than distraction, and had to brake hard enough that the gravel popped under her tires when she finally swung the wheel. The cottage sat back from the beach access, on pilings gone soft and silvery with weather, a single-story place with cedar shingles that had faded past brown into the color of wet ash. The listing had called it the Sandpiper, 4 stars, 31 reviews, most of them from summer people who'd never seen it like this, empty of tourists, fog sitting on the dune grass like something that had simply decided to stay. Between Yachats and Waldport in November, the whole coast felt half abandoned. Half the motels had their vacancy signs dark. The fish shack by the bridge had plywood over one window. Mara had picked the off-season on purpose. She was here to shoot fog studies for a photo essay on vanishing coastal towns, a real assignment with a real deadline, and she told herself that was the only reason, that the road name on the booking confirmation hadn't caught in her throat for even a second when she signed the rental agreement 3 weeks ago. The host communicated only through the app, a woman named on the account as Coastal Cove Properties LLC, no profile photo, no phone number listed, just a lockbox code, texted an hour before check-in, and a short message reminding her the propane heater took a minute to catch and not to worry about the noise it made when it did. Mara found that a little strange, the way you find most things strange, for about 4 seconds before you stop thinking about them. The first 2 nights were what she'd expected, wind working at the shingles, the heater ticking like a slow clock behind its grate. She slept badly, the way she always did in a new bed. And in the mornings, she walked the beach with her camera and came back with her boots full of sand and her fingers too cold to work the shutter properly. It was the 3rd morning she found the driftwood on the porch step, laid across the boards, like someone had set it down rather than dropped it. A gray, sea-worn piece, maybe 1.5 feet long, smooth everywhere the water had gotten at it. Near one end, someone had cut into the wood, not weathering, not the ocean's slow chewing, but 3 shallow notches, fanned out from a small spiral, the kind of mark a knife makes when a hand is steady and has done it before. She almost didn't look twice. Driftwood collected against porches all the time this close to the waterline, and half the beach walkers up and down this coast carved something into a piece of wood before they left it behind. She picked it up, turned it once in the gray light, and set it on the porch rail before she went in to make coffee, and she told herself it didn't mean anything that her hand had gone a little cold holding it. That afternoon, annoyed at herself for the current running under her skin all day, she carried the piece down to the tide line and pitched it as far out as she could into the surf. It went under. The water took it, the way the water takes everything. She didn't think about it again until the next morning, when she opened the door for her coffee and found it sitting on the top step in almost the same place, sand still wet in the grain, as if the tide itself had walked it back up the beach and set it down with care. She told herself a wave could do that. Storm surge, an unusual tide, the shape of the cove funneling debris back toward the pilings. She wasn't a fool, though, and she wasn't going to let a piece of wood run her thinking in circles. So the next day, she did it properly. She carried the driftwood 400 yards down the beach, past the tide pools, past the black rock shelf where the water sucked and spat, and she buried it 2 feet down in dry sand above the last high water mark, sand no wave had touched in a week. She marked the spot with a cairn of 3 stones, so she'd know if anyone disturbed it. The cairn was untouched in the morning. The driftwood was on her porch step anyway, sand crusted into the notches, like it had come straight up out of the ground on its own. She stood there a long time in her socks, the cold boards biting up through them, and she understood that this wasn't the ocean doing anything. Someone was walking to her porch in the dark and putting it there. There was an old aluminum shed behind the cottage, half sunk into blackberry vines, and in it, under a tarp, she found a trail camera, the kind people use to track deer or count erosion after storms, battery still holding a charge from whoever had used it last. She strapped it to the porch post herself, angled at the steps, and went to bed with her door locked and a kitchen knife on the nightstand, feeling a little ridiculous and not caring. The footage the next morning showed nothing until 3:40 in the morning, and then it showed a shape. A person, hooded, moving along the edge of the dune grass with the loose, uneven gait of someone favoring one leg, gloves on, the hood angled down and away from the camera, in a way that felt too deliberate to be luck. They set the driftwood on the step with something close to tenderness, the same spot every time, and were gone again in under a minute, swallowed by the fog at the tree line, before Mara's eyes could catch up to what her hands were doing, which was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had gone white. She messaged the host that morning, hands not quite steady on the screen. "Someone is coming onto the property at night. I have it on camera. I need to know who has access to this house." The reply came 40 minutes later, and it read wrong in a way she couldn't name yet. "That's just the neighbor. They've done that a long time, longer than the listing's been up. They don't mean any harm. Please don't worry yourself over it." She read it 4 times. Neighbors didn't apologize for a stranger like that. Neighbors didn't get a soft, protective little "please don't worry yourself," the kind of thing you said about someone you loved, not someone you managed a rental account around. She drove into Yakats for groceries and for the plain animal comfort of being around other people, and she ended up in a diner off the highway with red vinyl booths and a coffee pot that had clearly been on the burner since 6 a.m. The waitress, 60-something, forearms like rope, asked where she was staying, the way people do down here when there's nothing else to talk about, and Mara said the road name before she thought better of it. Tillicum Beach Road, the gray house up on the pilings. The waitress's face did something small and quick, there and gone, the kind of flinch people make when a name lands somewhere they'd rather it hadn't. She topped off Mara's coffee without being asked, and said, low, like she was passing along something she wasn't sure she should, that a girl had gone missing off that stretch of beach a long time back. 10 years, maybe a little more. Walked out at dusk and never walked back. They'd dragged the cove for a body and never found one. House sat empty 2 years after that, because nobody local would take the booking, and then it changed hands, got a new name, new photos, new everything. Mara's coffee cup was very hot against her palms, and she held it there anyway, because there was a sound starting up in her ears, like wind through a gap in a window, and she recognized it as the sound of the last 10 years of her life, folding back down into a shape she'd spent a decade trying to keep flat. Her sister had gone into the water off a rented beach house on this coast 10 years ago. She had told herself for a decade that the details didn't matter anymore, that grief eventually stopped needing an address. She had picked this listing off an app with a stranger's photographs and a new deck and different siding, and she had told herself, driving down, that the tightness in her chest on the turnoff was only nostalgia for the coast in general, the whole gray, familiar sweep of it, and not this specific gravel spur, this specific angle of dune grass against a specific slope of roofline she'd spent 10 years trying not to picture. She didn't say any of that to the waitress. She paid for the coffee and drove to the Waldport Library instead, because if she was going to fall apart, she wanted to do it somewhere with fluorescent lights and other people breathing nearby. The librarian pulled the old clippings without much fuss, a small town's small archive, a manila folder that hadn't been opened in years, going by the dust along its top edge. Iris Voss, 22, last seen walking the beach at dusk, behind a rental cottage on Tillicum Beach Road. Presumed drowned. Case closed as accidental death 2 years later. No body recovered. File inactive. Mara had read versions of these same 3 sentences 100 times a decade ago, in a different font, from a different paper, and it still took the air out of her to see her sister's name typed plain and small like that, like a fact instead of a wound. The librarian, an older man with reading glasses on a chain, mentioned almost as an aside that he kept a folder of old real estate flyers too, local history nobody asked for anymore, and did she want to see what the place looked like before the new owners fixed it up. She said yes, because her mouth said yes, before the rest of her caught up. The flyer was faded newsprint gray, a listing from a rental agency that didn't exist anymore. The photograph grainy, the way film scans always are. Same porch. Same weathered post at the corner of the railing, though it had been repainted since. And wedged into the gap between two railing boards, small enough that anyone glancing at the photo would take it for a stray branch and nothing more, was a piece of driftwood with a spiral notched into one end. She held her phone up next to the flyer and zoomed in on both images at once, her hand shaking hard enough that she had to brace her elbow on the library table to hold the shot steady, and the notches lined up. 3 shallow cuts fanned from a spiral, the exact same hand, the exact same blade angle, the exact same piece of wood sitting on a porch railing 10 years ago, and on her own porch step 3 mornings running. She turned the flyer over out of some instinct she didn't examine too closely, and there, penciled small and slanted in the corner, where a realtor might jot a showing time, was handwriting she would have known blind, in the dark, with her hands tied behind her back. The particular left-leaning slope of it, the way the 7s got crossed, an affectation their father used and Iris had picked up and Mara never had. High tide by dark, don't wait up. It wasn't a real estate note. It was something their family used to say to each other on beach trips when someone stayed out too long past sunset. Half warning, half joke, entirely private. The kind of phrase that couldn't exist on the back of a rental flyer unless the hand that wrote it had once belonged to someone in this family. She sat in the library with the folder open in front of her and understood, with a kind of vertigo that had nothing gentle in it, that this wasn't a decade-old photograph of a coincidence. This was the same object. Somebody had kept this exact piece of driftwood safe and dry and whole for 10 years, through however many owners and renovations and repaintings this house had gone through, and had chosen, this particular week, to start putting it back on this particular porch, while she was the one sleeping inside. Not any renter. Her. Back at the cottage that evening, she went through every message the host account had ever sent her. Slowly this time, the way you reread something looking for the crack instead of the meaning. Most of it was boilerplate, check-in times, Wi-Fi passwords that didn't work, a reminder about the propane heater. But near the bottom, in a message sent at 2 in the morning 3 days before she'd even arrived, before the first piece of driftwood had ever shown up, there was a line that hadn't struck her as anything the first time she'd read it. Call the number below if anything in the house feels wrong. Day or night, I mean that. And under it, a string of digits she'd skimmed past because it looked like every other courtesy contact number on every other listing she'd ever booked. Except it wasn't every other number. It was her mother's old landline, the one disconnected years ago, the one Mara had dialed 1,000 times as a teenager to hear it ring in a kitchen 3 towns from here, a number that had no earthly reason to be sitting in a stranger's rental account unless the stranger had once lived in that house and dialed it herself. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dark kitchen with the porch light off, the way she imagined a person did the first time they understood they'd been sharing a house with something they hadn't let themselves name, and she waited. At 20 to 4, the fog outside the window had a shape moving through it, low and careful, favoring one leg the way the camera had shown. Mara didn't turn on a single light. She opened the door before the figure reached the steps and stood there in her socks in the cold, with her breath fogging in front of her, and watched the shape stop dead in the dune grass. Driftwood still in a gloved hand, every line of the body gone rigid, the way an animal goes rigid when it realizes the thing it was hunting has turned around. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a very long time. Then the hood came down. 10 years puts a lot of weather into a face. Iris was thinner than Mara remembered, her hair cut short and gone a duller color than it used to be. a thin white scar tracking down through one eyebrow that hadn't been there before, and she stood with her weight tipped off her left leg, in a way that explained the limp on the footage, without needing to explain anything else about how she'd gotten it. She looked like someone who had spent a decade making herself very hard to notice, and for one terrible second, Mara understood that her sister was afraid of her, the way you're afraid of the one person whose voice could undo 10 years of careful quiet in a single sentence. Iris talked fast and low, the words coming out like she'd rehearsed them in the dark 100 times, and never once believed she'd get to say them out loud. She hadn't drowned. She'd walked into the water only far enough to make it look real, timed to a tide table she'd memorized for a month beforehand, and a man who owed her a favor from a life before all of this had pulled her out past the rocks in a boat with no running lights. She said the name of the person she'd been running from only once, flat and quiet, the way you say a word you've trained yourself not to feel anymore, and didn't explain further, and Mara didn't ask her to. She said she'd spent 10 years, 30 miles up and down this same stretch of coast under a different name, managing off-season rentals under a company that existed mostly on paper, because it was cash-adjacent work that asked no questions and kept her fed, and because some nights, God help her, she couldn't stay away from a coastline that at least remembered the sound of her family's voices, even if it wasn't safe for her to remember them back. She said she'd seen a booking come through with Mara's name on it 11 days ago, on a system she managed from 3 towns away, and that she'd told herself for 6 straight days she wasn't going to do anything about it. And then she had anyway, because the driftwood was the one thing that had always been safe between them, a code from childhood that meant, I'm here, and I'm not ready, and please don't tell anyone yet. And she hadn't been able to think of another way to say all 3 of those things at once, without saying anything a stranger could understand. She said she didn't know if the man who'd made her disappear was still looking. She said that was the truth she hated most, worse than the drowning, worse than the 10 years, that she still didn't know, and that was why she was standing on a dark porch at 4 in the morning, instead of walking through the front door in daylight like a person who'd come home. Mara didn't say any of the things she'd imagined saying for 10 years. In the version of this she'd never let herself believe in. She didn't ask why. She stepped down onto the cold sand in her socks and put her arms around a sister who flinched at the contact before she let herself lean into it, and they stood like that a long time, while the fog thinned by degrees into the flat gray light that passes for dawn on this part of the coast in November. When they finally sat down on the porch steps, the piece of driftwood sat on the board between them, notches worn smooth in places from 10 years of handling, and neither of them touched it. Iris asked for time. Not forever, she said. Just a little longer, long enough to be sure, and Mara understood that this wasn't an ending, so much as the first honest sentence in a story that had been running silent under her whole life for a decade. Down the beach, where the fog still held along the tide line, Iris's eyes went there out of old habit, scanning the empty gray the way a person does who has spent 10 years checking a door is locked before they can sleep. There was nothing there, just the water doing what it always does, and the cold, and the gulls starting up somewhere past the rocks, and 2 sisters sitting on a porch that had kept one small, stubborn secret alive the whole time, waiting for someone to finally be standing there to receive it. The house on Fenwick Street had been through 6 landlords since it was built in 1911, and Mara Voss liked that about it. Something about a place that had outlasted that many owners felt sturdier than anything new. She signed the lease in March, a 1-year rental on a 2-bedroom craftsman with a sagging front porch and a laurel hedge that needed cutting back, 4 blocks from the Kenton Strip, and close enough to smell the rain coming off the river most mornings. It was cheap for what it was, which should have told her something, but St. John's still had pockets like that if you knew where to look. And after 11 years, married to a man who controlled every square foot of shared space, cheap and hers felt like winning. The landlord was a guy named Gary Ostrander, who owned 6 or 7 places scattered through the neighborhood and ran all of them the same way, by phone, from a truck, between other jobs. He'd met her once to hand over the keys, and hadn't been back since. That was fine with her. She worked per diem in the ER at Legacy Emmanuel, 3 or 4 12-hour shifts a week that never landed on the same days twice. And she liked coming home to a house that nobody was watching over her shoulder in. The first week, small things felt off, but she chalked all of it up to exhaustion and the strangeness of new walls. A kitchen chair she was sure she'd pushed in was pulled out 3 inches when she got home from a night shift. The hallway light switch was in the wrong position, up instead of down, and she told herself she'd probably bumped it carrying boxes. Old houses breathe, people say. Floors settle. Doors swing a little on their own, if the foundations shifted even slightly. She'd been running on 5 hours of sleep a night for a week. None of it seemed worth mentioning to anyone. It was during that first week, while she was clearing dead leaves out from under the porch railing, that she found a key taped to the underside of the wood, wrapped in a strip of packing tape gone brittle and yellow with age. It wasn't hidden well, more like forgotten. She peeled it off, turned it over in her palm, a plain brass key with no tag, and figured it belonged to some tenant, 2 or 3 leases back, who'd stashed a spare out there, the way people do, and then moved out without remembering it existed. She dropped it in the junk drawer in the kitchen, the one with the rubber bands and the takeout menus, and didn't think about it again for a long time. She called Gary about 10 days in, mostly to ask about the water heater, but she mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she assumed the locks had been changed before she moved in. "It's just a habit now. After the divorce," she told him. "I like knowing it's just my key." Gary said, "Oh yeah, of course. We always rekey between tenants. Standard practice." But there was a half-second gap before he said it. The kind of pause a person leaves when they're repeating something they've said to a lot of other people and haven't actually checked lately. And something about the smoothness of the answer sat wrong with her, even though she couldn't have said why. Her next-door neighbor was an older woman named Dot Alvarez, who'd lived on Fenwick Street since before Mara was born, and Dot was the one who first said the name. They were both out front on a Saturday, Mara raking wet leaves into a bag, Dot deadheading roses along the fence line, and Dot said, without any weight to it at all, "Oh, you're the one who took the Fen place." Mara said, "The what?" Dot said, "The Fen place. Lyle Fen. Lived there a good 3 years before you." Gary hadn't ever said the name Fen. He'd said something vague about the last guy skipping out on rent. Hearing it from a neighbor who said it like it was just the name of the house, the way people call a place the old Miller farm, 40 years after the Millers sold it, made the house suddenly feel like it belonged to somebody else, more than it belonged to her. The first real jolt came about 3 weeks in, after a night shift that ran long because a multi-car pileup on the 205 filled the department at 3 a.m. She got home a little after 8 in the morning, and as she came up the porch steps, she saw the back gate at the side of the house standing open, the one she was sure she'd latched the day before, because the neighbor's dog kept getting into her yard. She walked around, latched it, told herself the wind had done it, though there hadn't been wind that week worth mentioning. That same night, lying in bed a little before 1 a.m., she heard the specific, unmistakable sound of a door handle being turned, slow and careful, from the back door off the kitchen. She lay still, heart going, and heard it stop. In the morning, the back door was locked, but only the knob lock was engaged, not the deadbolt, and she always threw the deadbolt, every single night, because it was the one habit her ex-husband had actually left her with that was worth keeping. She ordered a battery-powered camera off Amazon the next day and stuck it under the porch eave facing the driveway and side gate. 4 nights later it caught something. A man, maybe mid-30s, stocky, in a canvas jacket and a ball cap pulled low, standing at the bottom of the porch steps at 2:40 in the morning, not moving toward the door, just standing there, looking up at her dark windows, checking his phone, twice, like he was waiting on a text, and then walking back down the driveway and out toward the street. He never touched the door. He never touched anything. He just stood there, like a man waiting for a bus that wasn't coming, in her driveway, at 3 in the morning. She called the police the next day, and showed an officer the footage. He was polite about it, said they'd log it, but there wasn't much to act on, since nothing had been taken. No forced entry, no property damage, no threat actually spoken or shown. He said something that was meant to be reassuring, and instead lodged itself under her skin for weeks. Happens more than you'd think, ma'am. Guy doesn't know the tenant changed, still thinks his buddy lives here, comes by to smoke a cigarette, or drop something off out of habit. People are creatures of routine, even when the routine doesn't make sense anymore. That explanation almost worked on her, except she kept coming back to the deadbolt. A guy visiting an old friend out of habit doesn't test your back door handle at 1 in the morning and leave it exactly the way he found it. Careful, quiet, like a man checking whether something was locked, rather than trying to force his way past it. That wasn't habit. That was somebody confirming information. She decided to go straight to the source instead of the landlord, and looked up the company Gary always used, a place called Peninsula Lock and Key, out toward Lombard. Been there for decades. The kind of shop with a hand-painted sign and a guy behind the counter who remembers half his customers by name. She told the man at the counter, whose name tag said Denny, that she just wanted a personal record of when the rekey on her address had been done, for her own peace of mind, since she'd started renting the place and wanted to know exactly how many keys existed out there. Denny pulled the file, and what he told her rearranged everything she thought she understood about that house. The rekey had happened, yes, right on schedule, the same week she'd moved in, but it hadn't been ordered by Gary Ostrander at all. It had been ordered and paid for, in cash, by a man named Lyle Fenn, using an account that had been on file with the shop for years, requesting a fresh cylinder and a single new key cut to himself. And according to the file, he'd never come back in to pick up that key. Mara stood at the counter for a second, not understanding why an outgoing tenant would pay to rekey a house he was leaving. Denny shrugged and said, "People do it sometimes if they've lost track of who has copies floating around. Exes, roommates, whoever. They just want a clean key for themselves before they hand the place back over." He said the job had gone through fine. A tech had swapped the cylinder that Tuesday, and the cut key for Lyle had been sitting in the will call drawer ever since, tagged and waiting, because Lyle just never showed up for it. She almost let herself feel better hearing that. A key sitting in a drawer at a locksmith shop wasn't in anyone's hand, but Denny kept talking, the way people do when they're thinking out loud, and mentioned that Lyle had actually called the shop twice since then, asking if his key was ready, most recently only about 10 days back. Denny had told him, "Yeah, it's here whenever you want to swing by," and Lyle had said he'd get to it. Mara asked, carefully, if Denny was completely sure nobody had picked it up already. He said he was sure, the tag was still on it, he could go check right now if she wanted. He did. Came back a minute later, holding a single brass key, with a paper tag rubber banded around it. Fenn, written on it in ballpoint, and set it on the counter, almost like an apology. Then he paused, and asked his younger guy in the back, a kid named Cody who did Saturday shifts, whether he remembered anybody asking about a Fenn pickup. Cody thought about it and said, "Oh, yeah, actually, some guy came in a few weeks back, said he was picking it up for his buddy Lyle, showed me a text on his phone with the ticket number on it, so I gave him a copy." Denny's face changed when he heard that. He said, "That's not supposed to happen. We don't do that." And Cody said, "I didn't know, man, he had the number." So there were two keys that mattered now instead of none. The one on the counter, still there, tagged, never claimed by Lyle himself. And a second one, cut off the same order, handed across a counter to a stranger, in a ball cap, who knew a ticket number he had no business knowing, unless Lyle had given it to him directly. Mara drove home with the untouched key from the drawer sitting in her cup holder, and called Gary that same afternoon, laying out everything Denny had told her, waiting to hear him sound as unsettled as she felt. Instead, there was a long silence on the line, the kind that told her before he said a word that he already knew some version of this. When he finally talked, it came out sideways, in pieces. Lyle still had some tools down in the basement, he said. Lyle was owed a little money still, some final settlement on rent, and a side job he'd done rewiring part of the kitchen a couple years back. Cash under the table, nothing on paper, and Gary had told him it was fine to swing by sometime and grab his stuff, since Gary hadn't gotten around to clearing the basement out before Mara moved in. He said it like it was a small, reasonable courtesy between two grown men, not like it was the reason a stranger had been standing in Mara's driveway at 3 a.m. She went down into the basement that night with a flashlight before she could talk herself out of it, and it took 20 minutes of moving old paint cans and rolled-up carpet before she found it. Tucked behind a wall of pink fiberglass insulation near the electrical panel, a steel toolbox bolted straight into the floor joist with a padlock on it, and beside it, a tangle of wiring that had clearly never been inspected or permitted by anyone, splices wrapped in electrical tape instead of proper junctions, running hot to an outlet that should not have had that kind of load on it at all. It wasn't a box of forgotten hand tools. It was bolted down. Nobody bolts down a box of pliers. She didn't force it open that night. She went back upstairs, sat at her kitchen table, and let herself really think about who Lyle Fenn was for the first time since she'd heard his name from Dot over the rose bushes. She went back to Dot 2 days later and asked, straight out, what Lyle had been like as a neighbor. Dot's face did something complicated, and she said there'd been a woman living there with him the last year or so, a girlfriend named Renee, quiet, kept to herself, and that toward the end there'd been shouting some nights, loud enough to hear through both sets of walls, and then one week Renee was just gone. No goodbye, no moving truck, just gone. And Lyle told anybody who asked that she'd moved back to her sister's in Salem. That night, Mara looked up what she could find in the Multnomah County court records, which took about 10 minutes because the site is public and searchable by name, and found a restraining order filed by a Renee Castillo against a Lyle Fenn a little under 2 years earlier, citing repeated unwanted contact, and one incident the filing described only in the clipped language of a court document, enough to make clear something physical had happened, not enough to say exactly what. She sat with that for a long time, and then she thought about the man on her porch camera again, standing there at 2:40 in the morning, checking his phone, not trying the door, just watching the house, and she pulled up her own work schedule against the dates stamped on the camera footage, and realized every single sighting had landed on a night she was scheduled for a 12-hour shift. Somebody knew when the house would be empty. Somebody had been tracking her patterns for weeks, not casing a basement full of tools, but timing something. She thought about calling the police again with all of it, the restraining order, the second key, the wiring, and she was still deciding how to lay it out when her shift got canceled at the last minute on a Thursday night. A call from the charge nurse at 4 in the afternoon, saying they were overstaffed and to stay home, paid anyway. It was the first time in 6 weeks her actual schedule hadn't matched what anyone watching the house from outside would expect. A little after 2 a.m., she heard a key turn in the back door, not a handle being tested. A key turning smooth in the lock, the deadbolt sliding back the way it does when someone who's done it 100 times before does it without thinking. She was awake instantly, phone already in her hand, and she moved into the bathroom off her bedroom, the only door in the house with a real lock, and called 911 in a whisper, giving the address, saying somebody had just let themselves into her house with a key, asking them to hurry, staying on the line exactly the way the dispatcher told her to. She heard him move through the kitchen, unhurried, footsteps heading for the basement door, and she realized in that moment he wasn't coming for her at all. He didn't know she was home. He'd learned her schedule well enough to believe the house was empty tonight, and he was headed straight for that bolted toolbox, like a man on a timer, like whatever was in it needed to move before someone got curious enough to force it open themselves. Portland police got there in under 9 minutes, which felt like an hour, and also felt impossibly fast. And they took him in the basement with the padlock already half worked open, with a bolt cutter, canvas duffel bag on the floor next to him. It wasn't Lyle. It was a stocky man in his late 30s named Bo Renner, Lyle's cousin, who it turned out had done side jobs with him for years, pulling copper wiring and fixtures off job sites they'd been subcontracted into. Salvage that was never salvage. Product that went straight to a scrapyard in Vancouver that didn't ask a lot of questions about serial numbers. Beau didn't hold out for more than about 20 minutes at the precinct. He gave up Lyle almost eagerly, like a man who'd been waiting for an excuse, and told detectives the toolbox held cash, close to $6,000, along with a phone, with photos and texts, documenting a string of thefts off construction sites, across 3 counties, going back nearly 2 years. Jobs where Lyle had been hired on legitimately as an electrician and had used that access to strip fixtures and wire after hours. He said Lyle had asked him to grab it because Lyle was laying low, staying somewhere out past Gresham, worried that all the attention around the new tenant asking questions was going to get somebody digging where he didn't want them digging. Lyle was picked up 4 days later at a motel off 82nd, and by then detectives had already connected 2 of the job sites in Beau's phone records to open theft cases that had been sitting cold for over a year. The restraining order came up in the file too, though Renee herself, when a detective finally reached her, was alive and fine, living in Salem exactly like Lyle had told everyone, just done with him and unwilling to be found by anyone connected to his name, which was its own kind of answer. Mara moved out 4 months later, not because the house was unsafe anymore, but because she couldn't make herself stop checking the deadbolt 3 times before bed. And some houses you just can't get back, once a certain kind of fear has lived in them alongside you. Before she left, she cleared out that same kitchen junk drawer she'd never bothered to sort through, and found the plain brass key still sitting where she'd dropped it that first week, the one taped under the porch railing, the one she'd assumed belonged to some tenant long gone. She held onto it for a second, before she remembered where she'd first heard the name Fenn, and it occurred to her, turning it over in her hand, that it had probably been Lyle's own backup all along, a second way in, stashed outside, in case the locksmith plan ever fell through, hidden the same week he ordered that rekey, the same week she moved in, and that she'd found it and pocketed it without knowing what it was on day 1. Without ever realizing she'd already taken away one of his ways back into her house, before he'd even had the chance to use it. Every gas station clerk between Bend and Burns will tell you the same thing if you ask them about Highway 20 after dark. Don't pick up hitchhikers past Riley. Doesn't matter if it's raining, doesn't matter if it's a kid, doesn't matter if he looks like he's been walking since noon under that sun with no water. Just keep driving. My Uncle Wade heard that warning 100 times growing up in Burns, the way you hear warnings about black ice or rattlesnakes, background noise you nod along to and forget the second you need it. He was 34 the summer he found out why people kept saying it. He was driving back from a welding job in Bend, taking the long empty haul through the high desert because it cut 2 hours off going the interstate way. That stretch out past Riley doesn't have much on it. Sagebrush flat in every direction. A few homestead ruins sitting off the shoulder with their roofs caved in. Telephone poles leaning like they're tired of standing. No cell signal for 50, 60 miles at a stretch. Not back then, and honestly not now either. Wade said the light out there does something strange in the evening, goes orange, and then this deep bruised purple, and the heat coming off the blacktop makes everything past a quarter mile look like it's underwater. He saw the guy from a long way off, standing right at the edge of the shoulder, near an old fence line, not far from where a burned-out homestead sat back off the road. Just a stone chimney left standing, with nothing around it. And here's the first thing that snagged at Wade, the first little detail that didn't sit right before he even had a reason to be scared. The guy wasn't thumbing, wasn't waving his arms, wasn't holding up a sign, wasn't doing anything a person does to flag down a ride. He was just standing there, facing away from the road, looking out at the sagebrush, like he was waiting on something out in the flat that hadn't shown up yet. Wade did what he figured anybody with sense does out there. He kept his foot on the gas and drove past him. But about a mile down the road, the guilt started working on him, the way it does when you leave somebody standing in country like that, with the sun going down and nothing but flat land for 50 miles. So he found a spot wide enough to turn the truck around, which took some doing, and while he was turning, he made himself remember the spot. That chimney, standing alone off the burned foundation, that's what he fixed on. He told himself, "That's my marker. I'll know the spot by that chimney." When he got turned around and drove back toward it, that's when the first real crack showed up in the evening. The hitchhiker wasn't standing where Wade had left him. He was further down the road, past the chimney, walking away from it at a normal walking pace like anybody would. Except Wade had only been gone maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes at the outside, turning that truck around. A man walking at a normal clip doesn't cover that kind of ground in 2 minutes. Wade said he actually slowed down and did the math in his head, mile markers against his speedometer, and it didn't work. It didn't come close to working. He pulled up alongside anyway, rolled the window down, and asked if he needed a ride, and that's when he got his first good look at the guy, and that's the detail that stuck with Wade for the rest of his life. The man wasn't sweating. Middle of July. High desert heat. A man just walked what looked like miles of open shoulder. And his shirt was dry. His face was dry. Not a bead on him anywhere. And his boots were wrong for the era. This old lace-up leatherwork boot style, Wade recognized because his own grandfather used to wear a pair just like them. The kind you don't see anybody wearing anymore outside of a museum photograph. Still, Wade said, "You tell yourself stories. Maybe the guy just doesn't sweat much. Maybe he likes old boots." He leaned over and asked again if he wanted a lift into Riley, and the hitchhiker turned his head just enough to look at him and said, real calm, "Don't stop at the crossroads." Nothing else. Not thank you. Not where he was headed. Nothing that answered the question Wade had actually asked him. Just that one line, like he was passing along a piece of information rather than making conversation. Wade sat with that for about 2 seconds, and then his gut told him to go. Plain and simple. The kind of instinct that doesn't argue with you, it just moves your foot to the gas pedal. He pulled away and didn't look in the mirror until he'd put a good half-mile between them, and when he finally did look, the road behind him was empty. No guy walking on the shoulder. Nothing. He made it to the gas station in Riley about 20 minutes later, hands still tight on the wheel, and he told the kid behind the counter about it, mostly to hear himself laugh it off. The kid didn't laugh. The kid went quiet and asked him, dead serious, "You actually stopped for him?" Wade said yeah, rolled the window down and everything, and the kid told him that most people who report seeing that guy near the burned homestead don't stop, and the ones who do stop, some of them don't come back through Riley again. Not that they turn up dead exactly. They just don't come back through. Truckers who used to run that route regular stop running it. People who live out that way move off within a year. Nobody in town could point to a body or a crime, but the pattern was old enough and consistent enough that everybody who'd lived in Riley more than a few years just accepted it, the way you accept a stretch of river that floods every spring. That alone would have been enough to keep Wade off that road at night for good, and for a while it did. But about 8 months later, back home in Burns, he got to talking with an old woman who ran the Historical Society out of a converted feed store, the kind of small-town archive that's really just a couple filing cabinets and a woman who remembers everything. He mentioned the burned homestead near the fence line outside Riley, thinking she'd have some story about a barn fire from the 70s. What she told him instead knocked the wind out of him a little. That homestead burned down in 1961. The family that lived there, a young man among them, had died in that fire, and the county bulldozed what was left of the structure the following spring. There was no standing chimney left by the time Wade would have been in diapers, let alone by the summer he drove past it, the landmark he'd used to navigate back to that spot. The thing he'd fixed his eyes on to remember where the hitchhiker stood shouldn't have been there for him to see at all. That fact alone changed the shape of the whole thing in Wade's head. It wasn't a ghost standing by a ruin. Somehow the ruin itself, gone 30-some years before he was ever born, had been standing there for him to use as a marker, the same night the man with the dry shirt and the old boots was standing near it. Like the road that night had borrowed a piece of scenery from decades earlier and put it back exactly where Wade needed it, just so he'd remember the spot. He went digging after that, the way people do once something's gotten under their skin enough that they can't leave it be. He found an old newspaper clipping from 1967 about a truck driver who vanished on that stretch and was never found. His rig discovered idling on the shoulder with the door open. He found a 1974 account, second-hand, from a rancher's wife, who swore a hitchhiker, near that same burned homestead, told her husband not to stop at the crossroads. Word for word, what Wade had heard. And her husband had a stroke behind the wheel 2 weeks later, out of nowhere, healthy as a horse before that. Every account fixed on the same landmark. Every account described the chimney standing, decades after it had been torn down. And in every account, somebody heard those same 5 words. For a while, Wade let it go, or told himself he had. Then the next spring, he had another welding job out past Riley and had to take that road again in daylight. No way around it, and he decided while he was out there he'd find the spot and prove to himself it was just a ruin like any other. Nothing supernatural about a pile of old stone. He found roughly where it should have been. The fence line was there. The general lay of the land matched what he remembered. But the chimney was gone. No foundation, no scorched earth, nothing. Like the Historical Society woman had told him. 30 years gone. That part he expected. What he didn't expect was that the mile marker nearest that spot read 4 numbers off from what he remembered logging that night. Like the whole stretch of road had shifted position by nearly a quarter mile sometime between his 2 drives. That's when things started happening to Wade directly, not just around him. Small things at first. He'd drive that highway for work and lose time he couldn't account for. Arrive somewhere 20, 30 minutes later than his own odometer, and his own memory of the drive said he should have. He mentioned it to my aunt, and she started riding shotgun with him on that route whenever she could. Which tells you how seriously she was taking it, even if she would have never say so outright. He stopped driving it after dark entirely, no exceptions, even if it cost him a job. The last time he ever tried to find that spot on purpose was maybe 2 years after the first night, and it wasn't curiosity that pushed him back out there. It was guilt again, the same guilt that made him turn his truck around the first time. He'd heard through the grapevine that another driver, a young guy hauling hay equipment, had gone missing on that same stretch that spring. Truck found running, door open, no sign of the driver anywhere on foot for miles in any direction. Wade got it in his head that if he could find the exact intersection, the exact spot, maybe he could figure out what it was, maybe warn somebody, maybe just settle it once and for all in his own mind. He drove out there in the daylight with his odometer reset from the Riley city limit sign, counting every 1/10 of a mile the way he had that first night, watching for the fence line, watching for any trace of a foundation, any scorch mark in the dirt, anything. He never found it. Not the chimney, not the burned foundation, not even a gap in the fence line where a driveway once cut off toward a homestead. The highway just ran on, flat and unbroken. Sagebrush on both sides, exactly the same as every other mile of that road, like there had never been a house there at all, like there had never been a crossroads there at all. He drove the stretch twice more, back and forth, checking his mileage against what he'd logged years before, and both times it came up clean, ordinary, nothing marking that piece of ground as any different from the 50 miles of nothing on either side of it. Wade told me this whole story himself, years later, sitting on his porch, with a beer he wasn't really drinking, and the thing he came back to at the end of it wasn't the hitchhiker's dry shirt, or the old boots, or even those 5 words. It was that the ground had closed back up behind whatever had happened out there, sealed itself the way a wound does, and left him with no way to ever prove it, no way to ever go back and check, no way to ever warn the next driver where exactly not to stop. Just the memory of a chimney that had no business standing, and a voice telling him not to stop at a crossroads that, as far as the land itself is concerned now, never existed at all. The house still smelled like her, 3 weeks after the funeral. Coffee grounds and wet wool, and the particular mildew that gets into old cedar siding on the Oregon coast and never leaves. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen in Siskin, looking out at the mill stacks across the river, and I counted only one plume of steam coming off them, instead of the three I remembered from when I was a kid spending summers here. Half shifts, somebody at the funeral had told me. Maybe less soon. Siskin wasn't much of anything by the time I came back to settle her estate. A gas station with 2 pumps, a grange hall nobody used except for the volunteer fire department's pancake breakfast, and a diner called Lou's that stayed open because the millmen needed somewhere to eat before the 6 a.m. whistle. Everything else had the particular quiet of a town that used to be bigger. Boarded windows on the old hardware store. A church with a congregation small enough to fit in the first 4 pews. I told myself I'd be there 2 weeks, sign some papers, sell the house or don't, and drive back to Portland. The first few days, nobody said much to me beyond condolences. June Bowen was well-liked, people said. She taught half the town's kids piano before her hands got bad, and they said it the way people say things they've said many times before, worn smooth like a stone you keep in your pocket. I didn't think much of the flatness in it. Grief does that to a town too, I figured. Everyone performing sadness they'd already spent. It was my 3rd morning at Lou's, working on eggs and grandmother's paperwork spread across a booth table, when I heard 2 women at the counter, talking low about a boy. Danny, one of them called him. Danny Coyle. Found down at the log pond back in June, they said, before I'd even gotten into town. I asked the waitress, a woman named Patty who'd known my grandmother 40 years, what happened to him. She topped off my coffee without looking at me and said he drowned. Simple as that. Tragic thing. And then she moved off to the next table so fast the pot was still tilted when she left. I noticed the 2 women at the counter had stopped talking entirely. Not just about Danny, about anything. They finished their meal in silence and left cash on the counter instead of waiting for a check. That should have been the end of it. Small towns don't like talking about their dead, especially not dead 19-year-olds pulled out of mill water. I understood that. What I didn't understand, not yet, was why the sheriff's report, which I found later, tacked to the corkboard outside the Grange Hall where they post county notices, was 4 sentences long. No autopsy findings listed. No mention of an inquest. Just Daniel Coyle, age 19, found deceased. Log pond. Accidental drowning. Case closed. Dated 2 days after he was found. I'd worked adjacent to enough newsrooms in my life to know that a county coroner doesn't usually clear a drowning that fast, not without so much as a toxicology note. But grief makes people want things finished quickly, so I let it sit in the back of my head and went back to sorting my grandmother's boxes. That's where I found the scrapbook. She'd kept every Siskin Sentinel clipping since the paper folded in the 90s, pasted into a photo album with the plastic sleeves gone yellow and brittle. I was looking for her marriage certificate for the estate lawyer when a headline caught my eye from an issue dated August of 1988. A boy named Peter Aldis, 19 years old, found drowned at the mill pond during the annual pond drawdown. The article was short, almost identical in shape to the report I'd read on the corkboard. No named cause beyond accidental. No follow-up piece the next week, which struck me as strange, because small papers milk a tragedy for months. I sat there on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom, with 2 nearly identical deaths, 38 years apart, same age, same water, and told myself it was just what happens in a town built around a log pond. Boys get reckless. Boys drink. Boys drown. I went back to Lou's the next morning mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and I sat at the counter instead of my usual booth, next to an old millwright named Gene Halverson who I'd met at the funeral. Gene had retired from the mill 20 years back, but still showed up every morning, like the whistle still meant something to him. I asked him, careful, working up to it slow, whether he remembered a boy named Peter Aldis. Gene's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. He looked at me for a second too long, the way you look at someone who's said something they shouldn't know how to say. Then he set his cup down and said, quiet, not unkind, that I ought to leave that be. I pushed a little, said I was just curious, small-town history and all, and he said something that I've turned over in my mind every day since. He said, That's the fourth one I've buried a story on, and I hope to God I don't live to see a fifth. He got up and left half his breakfast on the plate and put a 5 on the counter and didn't look back at me on his way out the door. I sat there with my coffee going cold, doing the math nobody wanted me doing. Not 2. 4. A pattern isn't 2 data points 38 years apart. A pattern is 4. And Jean had said it like a man reciting something he'd rather forget he knew, which meant there was a number in this town that people carried around and didn't say out loud, the way you don't say a dead relative's name too many times in a day. I spent the better part of that week in the Grange Hall's back room, where the county lets old newspapers and town meeting minutes molder in file boxes because nobody's bothered to digitize them, and nobody who'd want to has the budget. It took me 2 days of sneezing through dust and asking the clerk, a soft-spoken woman named Ida, to unlock the room each morning before I found the ledger. It wasn't hidden, not exactly. It was just filed under mill operations, miscellaneous, a cloth-bound book that looked like every other cloth-bound accounting book from the mill's early decades. But when I opened it, it wasn't board minutes or timber tallies. It was a list, names, ages, dates, all handwritten in a rotation of different hands across nearly 90 years, the ink changing color and the penmanship changing style, but the format never once varying. Name, age 19, without exception. Date, always within a week or two of what a note in the margin called drawdown, the annual lowering of the mill pond for maintenance. And beside each entry, in smaller writing, a single word, settled. There were 11 names in that ledger, 11 boys, going back to 1937, each one 19 years old, each one dated to the same handful of weeks every year the pond got drawn down, each one marked settled, like a debt paid off a book. Danny Coyle's name was the last entry, in ink so fresh it hadn't fully dried into the page, the way the older entries had. I sat on the floor of that dusty back room with that book open on my knees and felt something shift in my chest that wasn't quite fear yet. It was closer to the feeling of watching a structure you thought was solid ground turn out to be a trap door. I went looking after that for whatever it was they were settling, and it took the lawyer handling my grandmother's estate, a man named Ferris, who'd known her 50 years, and who I think only told me out of some sense that a person shouldn't die with certain things unsaid, to lay it out plain. In 1936, the mill nearly folded. Bank called the note. The timber market had cratered, and half of Curry County's mill towns were already boarding up storefronts and losing their young men to work camps, or the war that hadn't started yet, but everybody could feel coming. Siskin's mill was saved by a man named Elias Prather, an investor from Portland, who bought out the note and kept the mill running on the condition, and Ferris told me this looking at his hands, not at me, that the town's elders agreed to something with him that got written into a private compact, not a public one, something the founding families kept among themselves and passed down like a deed. Ferris didn't call it a sacrifice. He called it an arrangement to keep the mill fed, and when I asked him what that meant in practice, he said the same thing Jean had, that I ought to let it be. I didn't let it be, because by then I understood the shape of what I was looking at, even if I didn't yet understand why a town would agree to it, or keep agreeing to it for 90 years. It wasn't a monster in the water. It was a belief, calcified into practice, carried forward by people who'd convinced themselves, or been convinced by their parents and grandparents, that the mill's survival, their whole town's survival, was bought and kept current by one 19-year-old every so often, offered up at the same time every year. The pond came down, and the water ran low enough to see the bottom. I don't know if anyone in Siskin could tell you anymore whether they believed it was owed to Prather's ghost, or the land, or nothing at all, beyond habit, calcified into obligation. I only know that the sheriff signed off in 4 sentences, and the coroner didn't ask questions, and the diner went quiet when a name came up, because that's what a town does, when everyone already knows, and nobody wants to be the one who says it first. I might have driven back to Portland right then, papers signed or not, except that my sister Wren called me that same night to ask how the house was coming along, and somewhere in the small talk, she mentioned that her son, my nephew Toby, was driving down from Eugene in a few days to help me clear out the garage before I sold the place. Toby had just turned 19 in June. He'd be in Siskin for the pond drawdown, which Ida at the Grange Hall had mentioned to me that very afternoon was scheduled for the second week of August, same as it had been, she said without thinking about what she was saying, as long as she could remember. I went back to that ledger that night with a flashlight, because Ida had already locked up the Grange Hall for the evening, and I climbed in through a window I'd noticed didn't latch right. I found the newest page, the one after Danny Coyle's entry, blank, except for a single line penciled in lightly at the bottom, the kind of mark you make when you're not ready to commit it to ink yet, when you're waiting to see if it needs erasing. It said Toby Voss, and beside it, in the same soft pencil, the number 19. I drove to my sister's rented cabin outside town that night, and I laid it all out for her. The ledger, Jean's 4 names, the drawdown schedule, Prather's compact, all of it in one unbroken rush, because I thought if I said it fast enough, she'd hear how insane it sounded, and laugh at me, and tell me to get some sleep. She didn't laugh. She sat very still at her kitchen table, and when I finished, she told me, in a voice I didn't recognize as my sister's, that she knew. That her own mother-in-law had told her, when she married into a Siskin family, quietly, the way you tell someone the rules of a house they're marrying into. That most years it wasn't your family's turn, and you learned not to ask whose it was, and you were grateful, God help you, that it wasn't yours, right up until the year it was, and then you understood why nobody in this town ever left, because leaving didn't undo whatever you already owed for the years you'd been spared. I asked her what she meant to do. She looked at me like I'd asked her something in a language she used to speak fluently, and had spent years trying to forget. She said there wasn't a doing to be done, that the mill was up for a contract renewal that same month. The last big buyer Siskin had left threatening to pull out entirely, and that half this county's families depended on those checks, and that somewhere along the way, whether or not any of it was ever real, this town had decided it would rather carry a debt like that than watch the mill close and every family in it scatter to nowhere, because at least a debt like that only ever asked for one. I didn't argue with her about whether it was real. I don't think it matters whether it was ever real, not to the 11 names in that ledger, and not to what I did next, which was to drive to Eugene myself that same night, get to Toby before he ever packed a bag for Siskin, and tell him some version of the truth that didn't require him to believe any of it, only to stay away from that pond in August and every August after, and to never come back to a town that had already, in soft pencil, decided what he was worth to it. We left before the drawdown. I sold the house through Ferris by mail and never went back to sign the final papers in person. I think about that ledger sometimes, the 11 names stretching back to a banknote from 1936, and I wonder whose name got written in after Toby's got erased. Because towns like Siskin don't stop needing what they've convinced themselves they need just because one family drives off in the middle of the night. Somebody's name went into that book this past August. I don't know it. I don't want to know it. I only know that whoever's kitchen that pencil mark showed up in first probably sat very still, the way my sister did, and understood exactly what it meant, and said nothing, because that's the only agreement this whole town ever really kept. Kayla Reyes checked the gas gauge one more time before she turned off the highway, the needle sitting just above a quarter tank, and told herself that was fine, that they'd be back in town by 6 with plenty to spare. Beside her, Lauren Voss had her boots already laced, drumming her fingers on her knees, the way she always did before a hike, half nerves and half excitement. They'd found the trail on a backcountry forum 2 weeks earlier, a spur off Forest Service Road 2660, on the north side of Mount Hood, that led up through old-growth timber to something called Bell Ridge, a granite shelf with a view that supposedly made the 6-hour round trip worth every switchback. The gravel road narrowed the deeper they drove, potholes rattling the car, and Kayla's phone lost its last bar of signal about 2 miles before the pullout. Neither of them thought much of it. Dead zones were part of the deal out here. They parked next to a rusted Forest Service gate, the only vehicle at the trailhead, and before they started up the path, Wren pulled out her phone and snapped a photo of the wooden trail sign, the kind with routed white letters gone gray with weather. Bell Ridge Trail 4.7 mi, burned into the wood. It was a habit of hers. A photo at every trailhead. A little archive of every hike they'd ever done together. The timestamp on that photo would matter later, though neither of them had any reason to think about it yet. It was 9:14 in the morning, the light coming down clean and gold through the canopy, and they started walking. The first 2 hours felt like every other hike they'd done. Switchbacks cut through dense fir and hemlock, the trail floor soft with needles, the air carrying that particular mineral cold that hangs under a thick canopy even in summer. They talked about Wren's upcoming move, about a guy Kayla had been seeing, about nothing in particular, the kind of talk that fills the miles without either of them noticing the miles going by. Around what Kayla guessed was the 2.5-mile mark, they passed a cedar that had been split clean down the middle by some old lightning strike, its two halves leaning apart like a pair of doors left open, moss thick in the char. Wren said it looked like something out of a fairy tale and took a picture of that too. It was almost an hour later, by Kayla's reckoning, when they came around a bend and found the same cedar standing in front of them again, the two halves leaning apart the exact same way, the same moss in the same char. For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Wren laughed, a short, uncertain sound, and said the trail must loop back on itself somewhere, some kind of switchback they hadn't clocked. But the ground didn't feel like a switchback. They'd been climbing steadily, the grade never once dropping, and there had been no fork, no junction, nothing to explain how they could be looking at the same lightning-split tree from what should have been a completely different stretch of ridge. Kayla pulled out her phone out of habit, some old reflex to check a map, and remembered there was no signal to load one. She had screenshotted the trail map before they left, though, a habit from other backcountry trips, and she opened it now. The little blue dot that marked their position, still functioning off GPS, even without cell service, sat almost exactly where it had sat 20 minutes earlier. Not on the trail ahead, not further up the ridge. The same spot, give or take 100 feet, like they'd been walking in a slow, wide circle around a fixed point, instead of climbing a mountain. Wren wanted to blame the GPS. Bad satellite lock under heavy canopy, she said. Phones did weird things in thick timber. Everybody knew that. Kayla wanted to believe her. They pushed on, faster now, both of them watching the trail markers more carefully. The orange diamonds nailed to trunks every quarter mile or so, and for a while the markers came at what felt like the right intervals, and the unease in Kayla's chest loosened its grip a little. What she noticed next, she almost didn't say out loud, because it sounded insane even inside her own head. The light hadn't changed. They had been walking for what felt like 5, maybe 6 hours by then. Her stomach cramping with hunger, her legs heavy in that specific way. Legs get late in a long day, and yet the light coming down through the branches looked exactly like it had at 9 in the morning. No lengthening shadows, no amber slant of afternoon sun, the same flat, even gray gold it had been since they left the car. She finally said something when Wren asked, for the third time, whether they should stop and eat, and Kayla heard herself say, quiet, that she didn't understand why it wasn't getting dark yet, if they'd been out here all day. Wren checked her watch. It read 11:52. Both of them stood there a moment, Kayla's hunger and her exhaustion insisting it should be evening, the watch insisting it was still late morning, and neither fact would bend to make room for the other. They kept moving, because stopping felt worse than walking. An hour in, or what felt like an hour, they came to a stretch where the trail crossed a muddy seep, water running thin over bare dirt, and there in the mud were boot prints. Fresh, the mud still dark and wet at the edges where the pattern was cut. Kayla crouched to look, and felt something cold settle behind her ribs. The tread matched her own boots exactly, down to the worn patch on the left heel, where she'd caught a rock 2 summers ago and never gotten the sole replaced. The prints led away up the trail, ahead of them, in the same direction they were walking. She looked at Ren, and Ren looked back at her, and neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that nobody had passed them, that they hadn't seen another soul since the trailhead, that there was no way for a print matching Kayla's own worn boot to be sitting fresh in the mud, 20 feet ahead of where Kayla herself was standing. Ren said she wanted to scout the trail ahead, just to the next bend, just to see if it opened up or if the ridge was close. Kayla told her not to, said they should stay together, but Ren was already moving, saying she'd be 2 minutes, and Kayla let her go because arguing felt like it would take longer than just waiting. She counted the seconds by watching the second hand crawl on her own watch, and at what should have been 90 seconds, she heard Ren's voice call her name from somewhere off to the left, not ahead where Ren had walked, but off the trail entirely, deep in the timber, muffled by distance and brush. When Ren came back up the trail from the direction she'd actually gone, ahead as promised, she looked pale and unsteady, and she said she didn't remember the last few minutes at all, that 1 second she'd rounded the bend, and the next she was walking back toward Kayla, with no memory of turning around. She also said she'd heard Kayla calling for her, from behind, back the way they'd come. At almost the same moment, Kayla had heard her call from the left. Standing there in the flat, unchanging light, each of them holding a version of the last 2 minutes that didn't match the others, and didn't match either of their own accounts of where they'd stood. Something between them cracked. Kayla, scared in a way she didn't have a name for, snapped that Ren must be messing with her, playing some kind of prank that had gone too far, and Ren, just as scared, snapped back that Kayla was the one who'd insisted on this trail in the first place, that maybe Kayla had gotten them turned around and wouldn't admit it. They stood 10 feet apart in the timber, both breathing hard, both close to tears, before the fear of being alone out there won out over the fear of being wrong, and they closed the distance and walked on together, without apologizing, just gripping each other's sleeve at the elbow, like kids crossing a street. They didn't find Bell Ridge. They didn't find any overlook, any granite shelf, any view. What they found, sometime after that, walking on legs that no longer felt like they belonged to either of them, was the trailhead sign, Bell Ridge Trail 4.7 mi, the routed letters exactly as gray and weathered as they'd been that morning, and beyond it, sitting at the same odd angle it had been parked, Kayla's car. Both of them stood in front of the sign, in a state that Kayla could only describe afterward as a kind of blankness, too wrung out for relief, the two of them filthy, scraped, starving, feeling in every part of their bodies, like they had been walking through the night and into the following day. Ren, out of the same habit she'd started with, lifted her phone and took a photo of the sign again, some instinct to close the loop she'd opened that morning. It was back in the car, doors locked, heater running, both of them silent and shaking slightly, from something that wasn't cold, that Kayla scrolled back to find the first photo of the sign, to compare it against the second. Some need to see the two images side by side and make sense of what had happened to them out there. The first photo read, 9:14 a.m. She stared at it a long moment before she made herself look at the timestamp on the second, the one Ren had just taken, the one taken after a hike that had used up every ounce of food and light and patience either of them had. A hike that had felt, in both their bodies, like it had swallowed an entire night. The second photo read, 9:34 a.m., 20 minutes. Kayla turned the phone toward Ren without a word, and Ren looked at it for a long time. Her mouth opened slightly, like she meant to say something and couldn't find it. Neither of them tried to explain it in the car. They didn't have the strength, and some part of both of them understood, without saying so, that there wasn't going to be an explanation that made it sit right in their chests. Kayla started the engine and pulled out onto the gravel road, gripping the wheel harder than she needed to, and it was Ren who glanced back toward the trailhead as they rounded the first bend, out of habit, the same way she always looked back at a place they were leaving. She didn't say anything about what she saw. She told Kayla 2 days later, once they were both back in the city, and the forest was 1,400 feet of elevation and 100 miles behind them, that when she'd looked back, she'd seen 2 more hikers standing at the sign, A man and a woman, backpacks on, one of them lifting a phone to take a photo of the letters burned into the wood, the way people do at the start of something, with no idea yet how long the day was going to feel. For 3 weeks after it happened, I told myself there was a simple explanation, and every single day that explanation got a little harder to believe. I work the tasting room at a small vineyard tucked between Dundee and Carleton, the kind of place where the gravel lot has exactly 14 spaces, and everybody who pulls into one of them already knows your name. It's the kind of town where the guy at the hardware store waves at you from his truck before you even recognize the truck, where the Friday high school scores go up in the window of the diner by Saturday morning, where nothing happens that 40 people don't hear about by lunch. That closeness is part of why I loved it. It's also the reason none of this could be brushed off as some stranger's mistake. Everyone here would know a stranger. Everyone here would know me. It started on a Wednesday. I'd taken the day off to drive up to Portland for a follow-up on a root canal, 40 minutes each way. A whole day eaten by a dental chair and traffic on 99W. I came back to my shift on Thursday, expecting the usual. Restocking the reserve room, wiping down tasting flights, listening to Denny complain about the bottling line. Instead, Denny looked up from the register and said, "Hey, thanks for covering that bus tour yesterday. That was a mess and a half. I told him I wasn't even in town yesterday." He laughed. The way you laugh when you think someone's finishing a joke you already know the setup to. "Sure you weren't," he said, and went back to counting the drawer. I let it go. People mix up days. I mixed up days all the time during harvest. But it kept happening, and it kept happening with details that didn't belong to a mix-up. Priya mentioned, a few days later, that I'd made my joke about the 22 Pinot smelling like a wet dog before it opens up. A joke I'd made maybe 200 times over 3 vintages. A joke that was mine, the way a scar is yours. She said it like it was nothing, like she was just ribbing me for repeating myself. Then, that Saturday, old Mr. Alvarez caught me outside the post office and thanked me for how patient I'd been with his granddaughter, who apparently had asked me 40 questions about tannins the day before. The same Wednesday I'd been sitting in a dental chair in Portland, with my mouth propped open. He wasn't confused about the day. He'd looked at his own calendar to make sure, because his granddaughter's visit was tied to her school break, and he told me the date without me even asking. That was the first time it stopped feeling like a joke, and started feeling like something I needed to actually solve. I went back to Denny with it, more serious this time, and he must have heard something in my voice because his face changed too. And that's when he said the thing that I still think about more than anything else that happened after. He said, "How's the cut, by the way? You had a paper towel on it half the shift. I told you to go grab a Band-Aid from the office." I hadn't told anyone about a cut. I hadn't cut myself yet. Not that Wednesday. Not during the day, anyway. It was that night, after I got home from Portland, that I sliced the side of my hand on a broken piece of a wine glass I was rinsing out in the sink. A stupid clean cut across the base of my thumb that I wrapped in a paper towel because I couldn't find the Band-Aids either. Nobody had seen that. Nobody could have seen that. It happened at 9 at night, alone, in my own kitchen, on the same day I supposedly had it wrapped in a paper towel behind the tasting counter 14 hours earlier. I didn't sleep well after that conversation. I started pulling together everything I had. The timestamp on the dental office's confirmation text, a photo I'd texted my sister from the waiting room with the location tag still on it, a coffee receipt from the shop across the street from the dentist, stamped 1:47 p.m., the exact hour Denny swore I'd been pouring a flight for a party of 12. I laid it all out on the break room table, like evidence for a trial nobody had asked me to defend myself in. Denny looked at it, and Priya looked at it, and neither of them said I was lying. That was almost worse. They just got quiet. The kind of quiet where you can tell someone's rearranging a memory in real time, and it isn't fitting back the way it used to. Owen, who owns the place, finally said what none of us wanted to say out loud. "Let's just pull the camera footage. Settle it." We watched it in the back office. The 3 of us crowded around a monitor, that's usually only checked when a case of wine goes missing off the loading dock. The footage was grainy, the way cheap DVR footage always is, but it was clear enough. It was clear enough to see the woman behind the counter tuck her hair behind her ear, the exact way I do, lean her hip against the counter the exact way I do, laugh with her head tipped back at something a customer said, the exact way I laugh, and about 11 minutes in, she turned her hand over to look at it, the way you check on a cut that's bothering you, and there it was. A thin, fresh line across the base of her thumb, no bandage yet, nothing on it but the sting of something that just happened. The same cut, in the same place, hours before I actually got it. Owen checked the timestamp against the DVR box itself, not the software overlay, because he wanted to rule out anything being edited after the fact. It matched the server log. Nobody had touched the machine. There was no gap in the recording, no skip, no seam where a splice might sit. It was just there. A woman who was me, doing things I never did, wearing the cut I hadn't gotten yet. On a day I could prove down to a coffee receipt that I wasn't in this town at all. I want to tell you the room went cold, or my stomach dropped, or some other clean, small phrase. But honestly, what I remember is just how ordinary the footage looked. That was the part that got under my skin. She wasn't moving wrong. She wasn't a shape wearing my face like a costume. She was doing my job the way I do my job, down to the muscle memory. And the only thing that gave her away was a wound that hadn't happened to me yet. After that, it stopped staying contained to the tasting room. My mother called me 2 weeks later to thank me for our long talk the previous Tuesday, a call I never made, about my cousin's wedding and whether I was bringing anyone. She could quote things back to me, little things, the kind of things a stranger doesn't guess and a recording doesn't fake, an old nickname for my cousin's fiancé, a private joke about my aunt's casserole, things that lived only in the specific shorthand my mother and I use with each other. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call for longer than I want to admit. I went to a doctor. I want to be honest about that, because I wasn't ready to believe I wasn't just losing hours somewhere, blacking out, dissociating, something with a name a doctor could hand me, and a pill that could fix it. They ran a sleep study. They ran an EEG. They asked me questions about drinking, which felt almost funny, given my job, and about stress, and about whether I'd had head trauma. Everything came back clean. No seizures, no blackout pattern, nothing on paper that explained a body that could apparently be in two places, doing two different things, hours or days apart from itself. By then, other people in town had started mentioning it too, carefully. The way you bring up something you're not sure is polite to bring up. The woman at the post office said she'd seen me mailing a package the same morning my sister had picked me up from the airport an hour away. Both things true, both things witnessed, both things impossible together. It wasn't just my job anymore. It was becoming the whole town's low hum of a feeling that something about my schedule didn't add up, and none of them were unkind about it, which somehow made it worse. Nobody was scared of me. They were just quietly, patiently confused, the way you'd be confused about a stranger's face on someone you love. I decided I needed to see it happen, instead of hearing about it after the fact. Owen had a wine club shipment day coming up, the kind of Wednesday that seemed to be when most of these sightings clustered, and I arranged to be somewhere completely verifiable during it. My sister's place, an hour away, on a video call with her the entire afternoon, time-stamped, both of us on camera the whole time, so there could be no argument later about where I actually was. I asked Denny to keep his phone on him at the tasting room and just film if anything felt off. At 2:14 in the afternoon, while I was mid-sentence with my sister on a video call that still exists, with a timestamp on it, my phone buzzed with a video from Denny. I watched it while my sister's face was still up in the corner of my screen, both of us watching it together in real time. It was the tasting room, the same counter, the same light coming through the west windows the way it does every afternoon. And it was me, pouring a flight for a couple I didn't recognize, laughing at something, tucking my hair back. Then she looked up, not at the couple, not at Denny, straight into the phone, straight down the lens, like she'd known exactly where the camera was the whole time. She didn't look confused or startled the way you'd expect if she'd been caught at something. She just smiled, small and easy, the smile I give people I've known a long time. And she said something. Denny's audio was rough, wind and glass clinking, but he swore afterward, and still swears, that what she said was, "Tell her I've got it from here." I never found her. I went straight there after my sister drove me, 40 minutes that felt like 4 hours, and the tasting room was locked up early. Lights off, nothing out of place, except a single glass on the counter, with a half-inch of Pinot still in it, and a napkin folded under it the exact way I fold napkins without thinking about it. It's been 2 months now. The mentions have quieted down, not because the days have stopped, I think, but because people have gotten used to it, the way you get used to a strange smell in a house. You stop noticing it, or you decide it isn't worth mentioning anymore. Denny still waves at me from behind the counter on days I know for a fact I wasn't there, because someone tells me about it after, always a little too casually. My mother still calls to thank me for talks I didn't have. I still walk down Main Street some mornings, and every truck that passes lifts a hand off the wheel to wave, the way they always have, the way this town has always made you feel like you belong to it. I just don't always know anymore if the wave is for me, or if it's for whoever's walking half a block behind me, waving back. The light on Sauvie Island goes gray fast in October, and by 5:30 the pumpkin patch was down to maybe 4 cars in the gravel lot. My daughter Wren was 7 that year, and she'd been begging for one more run through the corn maze before we drove back to the bridge. I remember checking my phone, seeing it was 20 past 5, and telling the guy at the ticket stand we'd be quick. He barely looked up from folding tarps over the hay bales, said the maze closed at 6, last entry at 5:45, and to holler if we got turned around. Though nobody ever really got lost, it was more of a loop than a maze. 40 minutes tops if you dawdled. Wren ran ahead the second we passed the first turn. I let her get maybe 15 feet before I picked up my pace, because the corn was taller than me that year, dry and rattling every time the wind moved through it, and I didn't love how fast the light was dropping. I'll be honest, I was thinking about dinner. I was thinking about the drive. I wasn't thinking about anything happening to her. Not really, because it was a corn maze in a pumpkin patch on a Tuesday, and the worst thing that usually happens in a place like that is somebody twists an ankle in a rut. Then I turned a corner, and she wasn't there. I want to be precise about this part, because I've gone over it so many times since. It wasn't that she was out of sight for a long stretch. It was maybe 40 seconds. I called her name once, casual, the way you do when you're mildly annoyed, not worried. No answer. I called it again, louder, and I heard corn stalks moving somewhere to my right, off the path, which didn't make sense because the paths were cut clean, and the stalks on either side were planted thick. Not the kind of thing a kid could just walk into. I pushed through anyway, corn leaves cutting little lines across my forearms, and I found her standing in a gap between 2 rows, facing away from me, completely still. When she turned around, she was smiling. Not scared, not upset. She said, "You're not supposed to sneak up like that. It's not fair." Like I'd broken some rule she'd been operating under for a while. I asked her what she was doing off the path, and she said she'd been playing a game with the boy. I said, "What boy?" And she pointed further down the row, into corn, that from where I stood looked completely undisturbed. No path, no gap, nothing. I told her we were leaving. She didn't argue, which in hindsight is its own strange detail, because Wren argued about everything back then. Bedtime, broccoli, socks. She just took my hand and walked out with me, like the whole thing was over and settled in her mind. At the entrance, I asked the ticket guy if there was another family still inside, another kid, and he said no, we were the last ones in. He'd been keeping half an eye on the gate the whole time, and nobody else had gone through since a group left around 5. I stood there a second doing the math on that, because Wren had been fewer than 50 feet from me, in a straight sight line for at least part of that gap, and there was no version of the layout where another kid could have slipped past me without me seeing them. In the car, she started telling me about the game, unprompted, in that flat recitation voice kids get when they're repeating something rather than inventing it. She said the boy taught her the rules. Rule 1, you count to 100 before you start. Rule 2, you can talk as much as you want, but you can't say your own name. Rule 3, and she said this one twice, like it mattered more than the others, you are never allowed to look back. Not even a little, not even if you hear something. She said the boy told her that's how you lose. I laughed it off in the car, the kind of laugh you do to reassure yourself more than anyone else, and asked her what the boy looked like. She said he was older than her, but not a grown-up, and that he had dirt on his knees, like he'd been kneeling in the rows a long time. I asked how long she'd been playing with him, and she said, since the second time we came, which stopped me cold, because we had only ever been to that maze once before, back in September, on a Saturday with maybe 200 people crawling through it. That night I went through the photos on my phone from that day, mostly out of a need to do something with my hands. There were 6 pictures from inside the maze, Wren grinning under the tall stalks, one blurry shot of her running ahead. In the second to last one, taken maybe 4 minutes before I lost sight of her, there's a gap in the corn behind her, off to the side, the kind of gap that shouldn't have been there given how tightly that field was planted. I zoomed in, and there's a shape in it. Not a face, not anything I could swear to in a courtroom, just a paleness, low to the ground, about the height a kneeling child would be. I called the farm 2 days later. A woman answered, older, and I asked if there'd ever been trouble in that maze, kids wandering off, anything like that. She got quiet in a way that told me the question wasn't new to her, and she said the maze had been redesigned 3 years back, after a family complained their son had gone missing inside it for almost an hour before turning up fine, saying he'd been playing hide-and-seek with somebody, and that they'd looked into it and found nothing, no other family unaccounted for, no evidence anyone had been in there. She said they get 1 or 2 stories like that every season, and mostly chalked it up to kids and imagination and the acoustics of tall corn, playing tricks on people's sense of where sound comes from. I let it go, not because I believed her exactly, but because there wasn't anywhere to take it. No crime, no injury, no missing person. Just a story my daughter told me on a car ride. Except she kept telling it. Weeks later, at bedtime, she'd bring up the rules again, unprompted, the way you'd remind a sibling of an inside joke. Count to 100. Don't say your name. Never look back. I started noticing she'd play a version of it in the backyard, walking in slow, careful loops around the fence line at dusk, refusing to turn her head even when I called her from the porch, answering me only after she'd finished her circuit. I asked her once who taught her that specific detail, the counting, the naming, and she looked at me like I was slow and said, "The boy did, Dad. I told you already." I started digging harder after that, the way you do at 11 at night with a laptop, and a bad feeling you can't name to anyone without sounding unhinged. I found a message board, mostly parents in the Portland area, and in an old thread from 4 years earlier, a woman described almost the identical set of rules, counting to 100, no names, never look back, taught to her son by, in her words, a kid who was always there, but never with his own parents, at a different corn maze 40 miles south. Her post ended with her saying they never went back to that farm, and that 6 months later, her son stopped mentioning the game entirely, and refused to explain why when she asked. That detail sat wrong with me for days. Not that the game stopped, but that it stopped, and nobody ever asked why with any real force, because it read to me, like relief, dressed up as forgetting. I went back to the maze one more time, alone, on a weekday when the farm was doing off-season upkeep, and I told the same woman I wanted to walk the rows myself before they tore the corn down for the year. She let me, mostly because I think she wanted to be rid of me. About 2/3 of the way in, off what would have been the exact stretch where I lost sight of Wren, I found a flattened patch of stalks, maybe 4 feet by 4 feet, pressed down and yellowed, like something had been lying or crouching there for a long stretch of days, not hours. Near the edge of it, half buried, was a child's shoe. A boy's sneaker. Small, the kind that fits a 6 or 7-year-old. Weathered enough that it had clearly been there through at least one hard rain. I didn't touch it. I called the woman over, and she went pale, in a way that told me this wasn't the first strange thing she'd found out there, and quietly not mentioned to anyone. She said she'd call it in, and a week later a deputy told me over the phone that the shoe didn't match any active missing persons case in the county, that it was probably nothing. Kids lose shoes all the time, and that without any other evidence, there wasn't much for them to investigate. I believed the shrug in his voice more than I believed the words. Wren stopped talking about the game around Christmas that year, the way the boy on the message board's son had. I never pushed her on it, because some part of me was afraid of what pushing might loosen. But last week, almost a year later, we were driving past a billboard for the pumpkin patch, advertising the maze reopening for the season, and she went quiet in the back seat, in a way that felt different from her usual quiet. When I looked in the rearview mirror, she was staring out the side window, not at the billboard, past it, toward the tree line along the road. I asked if she was okay. She didn't answer right away. Then, very softly, not scared, almost fond, she said, "He said if I ever go back, I'm supposed to look for him this time. That's the new rule. You're allowed to look back if he asks you to." I haven't taken her back to that farm, and I don't plan to, but I think about that flattened patch in the corn more than I'd like to admit, and I think about the fact that whatever wore that shoe hasn't, as far as anyone can tell, ever been found. Claire Voss dropped her husband off at the Eagle Creek trailhead a little after 8 in the morning, the parking lot already half full of cars, with fogged windows, and dogs pacing in truck beds. Daniel kissed her through the open window, told her he'd be back by 6, maybe 6:30, if he pushed all the way to Tunnel Falls and back. He had a liter of water, a granola bar, a windbreaker tied around his waist. Nothing about that morning gave her any reason to look twice. She drove home, ran errands, picked up their daughter from her mother's, and didn't think about him again until 7 o'clock, when his phone went straight to voicemail for the 4th time, and the light outside had gone the color of a bruise. By 10 that night, she was standing in the same parking lot with a sheriff's deputy, watching headlights sweep across wet gravel, and the trail that had looked so ordinary that morning now looked like it went on forever into nothing. The search and rescue teams worked through the night and into the next 2 days, dogs and drones, and a line of volunteers in orange vests, moving through Douglas fir and wet basalt. The trail was popular enough that everyone assumed they'd find him fast, a twisted ankle off a switchback, a guy who'd lost the light and hunkered down to wait for morning. That's what the lieutenant told Claire on day 1, and she believed him, because the alternative wasn't something her mind would hold yet. Then, on the second afternoon, the dog handlers hit a wall. Right where the trail splits near the boulder field above the second falls, the scent dogs stopped, circled, and sat down. Not because they'd lost the trail in the usual sense, water washing it out or wind scattering it. They stopped because the trail simply ended there and didn't pick back up anywhere on the marked path. The handler explained it carefully to Claire, choosing his words. It looked less like Daniel had wandered off in a panic, and more like he'd made a decision right at that boulder field to walk somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. 2 days after that, a volunteer working a grid search, almost a mile off the marked trail, deep in brush that no casual hiker would ever push through, found his backpack. It wasn't torn open on the ground. It wasn't half buried under a log where an animal might have dragged it. It was hanging by one strap from a low branch, upright, zipped, at almost exactly the height a person would hang it if they wanted someone walking by to see it. The lieutenant who briefed Claire that evening didn't dress it up. He told her plainly that in 15 years he'd never seen a lost hiker's gear arranged like that. Lost people drop things. They don't hang them. When they opened the pack in front of her, hoping something inside would explain it, what they found only opened up more questions. His wallet was gone. His phone was gone. But sitting on top of his folded windbreaker, placed there deliberately, was his wedding ring. Claire stood in the ranger station bathroom for a long time after that, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to decide if the ring meant he'd been planning to take it off before something happened to him, or if it meant something so much worse that she didn't have a name for it yet. The investigation shifted after the ring. Detectives pulled financial records instead of just trail logs, and what they found didn't fit the man Claire thought she'd married. Over the 4 months before he disappeared, Daniel had withdrawn just under $19,000 in cash, in amounts small enough that no bank flagged them. There was a storage unit 40 minutes from their house, rented under a slight misspelling of his own name, paid for in cash every month since March. Claire hadn't known about any of it. She sat across from a detective who asked her, gently but directly, whether her husband might have been planning to leave her, and she had no answer. That didn't feel like a betrayal of a man who might already be dead in a ravine somewhere. The break came from a gas station, 40 miles east on the old highway, a place with one working camera above the pumps. Timestamp the night before he vanished, grainy but unmistakable. Daniel walked into frame, bought 2 bottles of water and a road map, and got into the passenger seat of a dark green pickup that was not his own. He didn't look afraid. He didn't look like a man being forced anywhere. He looked like someone keeping an appointment. It took the detectives another 9 days to run the plate down to a name, and when they told Claire, the floor of the room seemed to tilt. The truck was registered to a friend of her brother Mark's, a man Mark had grown up with, someone who'd been at her wedding, which meant her brother, at minimum, knew something. When she finally cornered Mark in his own kitchen and asked him straight out what he knew, he didn't lie to her face, the way she expected. He just went very quiet, and then he said the words that changed the shape of everything. Danny came to me first, before any of this. He came to me because he didn't know who else he could trust. What came out over the following week, slowly and in pieces, some from Mark, some from a federal agent who finally sat Claire down in her own living room, was that Daniel had found something in the books at Voss Construction, 8 months earlier. Discrepancies in supplier invoices that traced back not to some outside contractor, but to the man who'd built the company from nothing, Claire's own father. Small skims at first, then large ones, funneled through shell vendors for almost 6 years. Daniel had gone to Mark because Mark was already an auditor, and because Mark, unlike Claire, wasn't the old man's daughter. Together, they'd quietly started feeding records to federal investigators, and somewhere in that process, Daniel had been warned, not by federal agents but by someone inside the company, that people were starting to notice him asking questions. The disappearance on Eagle Creek wasn't panic, and it wasn't an accident. It was a plan, built with Mark's help, to pull Daniel out of reach before anyone connected the missing money to the man digging it up, and to do it in a way that looked like a tragedy instead of a man running scared, because a tragedy doesn't get investigated by the people he was hiding from. Claire wanted to be angry about being left out of it, and she was. But the anger didn't get much room to breathe, because 4 nights after the truth came out, a man she didn't recognize walked up her driveway at 11 at night and stood at the edge of her porch light long enough to make sure she saw him before he walked away. She called it in. The detective who came by the next morning didn't try to comfort her with the idea that it was probably nothing. He told her flatly that whoever had been skimming money from her father's company for 6 years now knew that federal investigators had a paper trail, and that the trail led back to her husband, and that her husband was currently impossible for them to find, which made her, sitting alone in that house with her daughter down the hall, the next most useful person to lean on. She spent the next 6 weeks with a car parked outside her house at night that wasn't hers, agents rotating through it in pairs, and no real word on where Daniel was, beyond a single sentence from the agent handling the case. He's safe, and he's cooperating, and that's the most I can tell you right now. Her father, for his part, said almost nothing at all, which she came to understand later was its own kind of answer. It ended, in the end, without fireworks. Federal charges were filed against her father and 2 supply chain vendors on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, almost 5 months after Daniel walked off the marked trail at Eagle Creek. 2 days after the indictment became public, Daniel came home. Not in secret, not through some dramatic reveal, just a car pulling into the driveway in the middle of the afternoon, and a man getting out of it, who looked thinner than she remembered, and older around the eyes, standing there, like he wasn't sure he still had the right to walk up his own front steps. What nobody warned her about, what nothing in those 5 months prepared her for, was the last piece, the one that came out slowly, over the months after he was home, in fragments during long silences at the kitchen table. The reason Daniel hadn't told her any of it from the start, the reason he'd trusted her own brother with the plan, before he trusted her, wasn't that he doubted her. It was that her father had, at some point in those 6 years, put money directly into the account Claire and Daniel shared for their daughter's college fund, small deposits dressed up as birthday gifts, money that federal investigators would eventually trace straight back to the same shell vendors. Daniel had found that months before he vanished. He hadn't told her because telling her would have made her, and their daughter's future, part of a federal case, and he'd rather disappear off a trail in the gorge and let her grieve something that wasn't true than watch her get pulled into something that was. She understood it, in the end, the way you understand a wound you're going to carry for a long time, rather than the way you forgive something. Daniel was home. Her father would likely spend years in a courtroom, instead of running the company he built. Her brother, who'd carried the secret longest and said the least, stopped coming to Sunday dinners altogether, because there was no version of that table anymore that didn't have an empty chair at the head of it. And somewhere in a drawer in their bedroom, still in the small evidence bag the sheriff's department had finally released back to her, was a wedding ring that had spent 5 months as the only piece of her husband anyone could find, sitting exactly where he'd left it, waiting for her to be the one who found it. The letter came from a lawyer in Enterprise, Oregon, and it told me 2 things I didn't expect. My grandmother Eleanor Voss had died in her sleep at 83, and she had left me the ranch, 600 acres of grazing land pressed up against the Wallowa foothills, plus the cattle, the equipment, and a single sheet of paper taped inside the front door that I wasn't supposed to remove. I drove out there in October, when the aspens were already stripped bare, and the wind came down off the mountains cold enough to make my eyes water. The ranch house sat low and square, at the end of a 2-mile gravel road, nothing around it but grass and fence line, and the kind of silence that isn't really silence, just the absence of other people. And there, exactly where the letter said it would be, was the list. 11 rules, typed on an old manual typewriter, the ribbon faded to gray in places. Don't let the cattle graze the north pasture after the first frost. Keep the root cellar door latched, not locked. Never call the dogs by name after sundown. Small things, strange things, the kind of rules you write down for a ranch hand who doesn't know any better, except I was the only person living there, and I already knew better than to argue with a dead woman's instructions. I figured it was superstition. Ranchers get like that, my mother used to say, though she said it with a bitterness I never understood until later. I called the neighboring rancher, a man named Wyatt Pierce, who'd worked cattle alongside my grandmother for almost 40 years, and I asked him, half joking, if he knew why she was so particular about a piece of paper on the door. He didn't laugh. He told me that in 1994, she fired a hired hand on the spot for propping open the root cellar door with a brick. No warning, no severance, just told him to get his truck off her land before dark. That was the first time I understood. The rules weren't decoration. They were law. I lasted about 3 weeks before I broke the smallest one. Late November, a gate left open by accident, not defiance, just exhaustion, after a 16-hour day, moving cattle by myself. 40 head got into the north pasture overnight, the one she said to keep them off after frost. Nothing happened to the cattle, but in the morning I found them bunched tight in the far corner of that pasture, packed shoulder to shoulder against the fence, refusing to spread out and graze the way cattle always do. They stayed that way for 2 full days, like something out there had scared them into a herd of one. That was when I started reading her journals instead of just her rules. I found them in a cedar chest in the room that used to be my mother's, going back decades, and in the earliest one, written when Eleanor herself was young, there was a second list, older than the one on the door, Written by hand, in a different script entirely. Her mother's, I realized, my great-grandmother's. And it had 14 rules instead of 11. 3 had been dropped over the years. One of the missing ones read, "Never let a Voss daughter sleep in the ranch house alone past her 18th birthday." My mother left this ranch at 17 and never came back. Not once, not even for a visit. And she never told me why. I'd always assumed a fight, the ordinary kind. But sitting in that cold bedroom with 2 generations of handwriting in my lap, I understood it had been arranged. Eleanor sent her away, and now I was 31 years old, sitting in the house alone, and nobody had sent me anywhere. I started noticing things after that, the kind of things I could still explain if I wanted to. Shapes at the tree line that resolved into nothing when I got the binoculars on them. The dogs refusing to go past the old barn after dark, sitting at the yard's edge and whining instead of following me the way they always had. A sound from the loft some nights. Not footsteps exactly, more like weight settling, the way a house sounds when someone leans against a wall in a room you can't see. I went looking for the well next, because it was the rule I hadn't broken yet, and the one that scared me most, for reasons I couldn't name. Never look into the west well, the list said, and true to Eleanor's habits, most of the property's other wells had been capped in concrete decades ago, except that one, which sat behind the equipment shed, under a sheet of plywood, weighted down with cinder blocks. I pulled the blocks off myself on a Tuesday afternoon with the sun still up, telling myself daylight made it safe, and when I looked down into the dark of it, it was just a well. Dry, stone-lined, maybe 40 feet deep. Nothing there at all. I felt almost foolish, kneeling in the dirt for something that turned out to be empty. Except that night, I heard my grandmother's voice come up through the floor vents from somewhere I couldn't place. 3 words. My own name. And I lay awake until sunrise convinced I'd dreamed it, because the alternative didn't fit into any shape I had room for. Wyatt came by the following week with a casserole dish his wife had sent, small-town condolence on a 2-week delay, and I finally asked him straight out what he thought was going on with the ranch. He set his coffee down and looked at me a long time before he answered, the way a man does when he's deciding whether you can carry something. He told me the story his own grandfather had told him, about a drought in the 1930s that broke everything around Wallowa County except the Voss land, which stayed green through 4 dry years running, while everyone else's cattle died standing up. He said the story went that a bargain got made somewhere back in that family, something given up, so the land would keep giving, and that every generation since had paid a little more to keep the arrangement standing. I didn't believe him, not fully, but I stopped sleeping well after that conversation, and I started reading Eleanor's letters instead of just her journals. Boxes of them she'd written to my mother and never mailed. 40 years of unsent apologies. In the last one, dated only months before she died, she wrote that she was tired of being the one who stayed, tired of being the only name on the list of rules that mattered, and that she hoped whoever read this after her would understand that she hadn't been protecting the ranch from anything at all. The barn loft was the rule she'd enforced hardest, the one underlined twice on the original list and circled in red on the older one underneath it. Never sleep in the loft alone after dark. No exceptions, no matter the reason. I'd avoided it for 2 months without even deciding to, the way you avoid a conversation you know is coming. Then in January, a heater malfunctioned in the equipment shed and started a fire that took out half my hay stores before I got it under control, and by the time I'd finished hauling water and shoveling snow onto the last smoking bales, it was past midnight. The house was a quarter-mile off across drifted snow, and the loft above the undamaged half of the barn was 20 feet away, with a space heater and a cot I kept up there for exactly this kind of emergency. I told myself the rule was for something else, some old superstition that didn't apply to a woman freezing after fighting a fire for 6 hours. I climbed the ladder and lay down on that cot, and I was warm within 20 minutes, and nothing happened. Nothing at all. I actually laughed out loud in the dark, alone, at how much fear I'd built around a piece of paper. Then I understood why the laughing had come so easy. It wasn't dread I felt lying there. It was relief. The kind that doesn't belong to a person who's simply tired. I lay still and listened to my own heartbeat slow down to match something outside my body. A rhythm coming up through the barn floor the same way Eleanor's voice had come up through the vents weeks before. And I realized the rule had never been keeping anything away from that loft. It had been keeping something inside it. Every year I'd spent alone on this land was a year I hadn't left, and every rule on that door hadn't been a fence around a danger. It had been a fence around me, tightening a little more each season, the same fence that had held my grandmother in place for 60 years, until the only freedom left to her was dying in her sleep and leaving the door open for someone else to walk through. My mother had gotten out at 17 because Eleanor forced her out, put her on a bus with a suitcase and never let her come back, not out of cruelty, but because she understood exactly what the land wanted and refused to let her daughter become the payment. Eleanor stayed instead. She let herself be the one the rules protected everyone else from, generation after generation, right up until the day she left the whole arrangement to me, in a letter and a taped-up piece of paper, either because she'd run out of time to warn me properly, or because some small, tired part of her wanted the weight passed on. I got off that cot before dawn and didn't look back at the barn. By the following week, I had a realtor's sign in the yard and Wyatt Pierce agreeing, reluctantly, to run my cattle on his own land until the sale went through. I never went back into the loft again, and I've never told anyone the whole truth of why I left, because there isn't a version of it that sounds like anything but grief talking. But I think about my grandmother sometimes, about 60 years of rules that looked like protection, and were really just the shape a cage takes when somebody loves you enough to stand inside it instead of you. I think about how long I might have stayed if the fire hadn't happened, how easy it would have been to keep believing the danger was something out there in the dark, instead of understanding, the way she must have understood decades before me, that the only thing those rules were ever built to keep in was us. Maren Voss had lived in the Applegate Valley for 6 years before she understood that nobody actually kept track of time there. Seasons blurred into harvest schedules, into canning days, into the long tables set up under the black walnut trees every Sunday, where 40 or 50 people ate together, like it was the most normal thing in the world. She'd come from Sacramento with a duffel bag and a busted marriage, and the valley had folded her in so gently she barely felt the seams close. Ruth Calloway had handed her a mason jar of peach preserves on her second day and said, "Welcome home, not welcome here," and Maren had cried in her truck afterward because nobody had called anywhere home for her in a long time. The community didn't have a name, not really. People just said the valley, said out here, said among us. There was a shared well system, a barter economy for eggs and firewood and dental work, a one-room schoolhouse where the kids learned math from a retired engineer named Theo, who'd apparently walked away from a life in Seattle without a backward glance. Maren grew squash. She fixed small engines. She started sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The first thing that snagged, the first little thread she noticed working loose, was small enough that she almost didn't clock it. She mentioned, at a Sunday dinner, that she might drive down to Medford the following week to renew her passport, thinking about a trip to see her sister in Portland. The table went quiet for maybe half a second, the kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all but a held breath, and then Ruth laughed and said, "Oh, we can help with that. No need to go all that way." And somebody else was already refilling her wine, and the conversation moved on like water closing over a dropped stone. Maren told herself she'd imagined it. She hadn't renewed the passport. Weeks passed and somehow it kept not happening, kept getting folded into some other task, some other need the valley had for her. And it was months before she thought about it again and realized with a small, cold jolt that she genuinely could not remember why. The second thing arrived, wearing the face of kindness, the way most bad things in the valley did. Her truck started running rough, a real problem, something electrical, and she mentioned it to Wade at the co-op because Wade fixed everything mechanical for half of what a shop in town would charge. Wade looked under the hood for exactly 4 minutes and told her it was the fuel pump. Needed a part he'd have to order. Might take a few weeks. Weeks became 2 months. Every time she asked, he had a different reason. The supplier, the shipping, the holiday. She started walking everywhere, borrowing Ruth's bike, and it took her an embarrassingly long time to notice that she had not, in 6 years, ever once driven her own truck out past the county line, without someone else in the passenger seat offering to navigate, offering to drive, offering. The third turn came from her sister, who Maren hadn't spoken to in almost a year, despite the fact that they used to talk every week. Cell service in the valley was spotty at best. Everyone said so. Everyone complained about it good-naturedly. But the community center had a landline, and Maren used it one gray October afternoon to call Portland on impulse, missing her sister's voice suddenly and violently. Her sister picked up and burst into tears. She said she'd been trying Maren's number for months. She said 2 people from the valley, a man and a woman Maren had never heard of, had shown up at her door back in the spring, calm and pleasant, and told her that Maren was doing wonderfully, was so happy, had asked them to pass along, that she needed some space, some time to heal. Please don't worry. Please don't call. Her sister had believed them. Why wouldn't she? They'd had an address. They'd known things about Maren's childhood that only family should know. Maren stood in the community center with the phone against her ear and felt the floor of her life tilt sideways. She didn't tell anyone what she'd learned. That was the 4th turn, the one inside her own chest. The decision to go quiet, to go careful, to start watching the valley the way you watch a dog that's never bitten anyone, but has started holding very still when you walk past. She began noticing what she'd trained herself not to see, the way Theo the school teacher had once mentioned, offhand, a life before the valley that included a name that wasn't the name on the mailbox. The way old Franklin, who everybody said had been in the valley 40 years, got a strange flicker in his eyes whenever anyone asked what he'd done before. Before. The way nobody, not one single person in 6 years, had ever told her they were leaving for good. People left for a week, a season, a trip. Nobody left. The 5th turn was the letter she found, not hidden, just tucked in a box of canning supplies Ruth had lent her. A letter dated 11 years earlier, addressed to a woman named Colleen, written in handwriting Maren didn't recognize, saying, "I know you're scared, but everyone here loves you. Nobody wants to hurt you. We just want you home. Please don't make us come get you again." Maren asked around, carefully, casually, whatever happened to a woman named Colleen who used to live out here. Nobody remembered a Colleen. Nobody remembered a Colleen so completely, so seamlessly, that the not remembering felt like its own kind of confession. She started planning in earnest then, and this was the 6th turn, the one that changed the shape of everything. She stopped trying to leave loudly and started leaving small, an object at a time, tucked into her jacket during trips to the co-op, driven the 4 miles into Ruth's mother's empty guest house that Maren had a key to, for reasons nobody questioned, because in the valley, everyone had keys to everything. Cash, copies of documents, a second phone she'd bought with money she'd been quietly skimming from selling eggs at the farmer's market and not reporting to the barter ledger. She smiled at Sunday dinners. She brought squash. She let Wade keep stringing her along about the fuel pump because a broken truck was cover, was camouflage, was a woman clearly too stuck to be a threat. It took her 4 months to get the truck's real problem fixed, secretly, 40 miles away, by a mechanic she paid in cash, and swore to silence, with a story about an abusive ex-husband, which wasn't even entirely a lie. She drove it back into the valley at night with the new part installed, and the old broken one sitting in the passenger seat, so if anyone looked, they'd see the same sad, busted engine they expected to see. She picked a Tuesday. Ordinary day, no gathering, no reason for anyone to be watching the road. She packed what she could carry without it looking like packing, told Ruth she was headed into Medford for groceries, and got in the truck at 10 in the morning, with her heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth. The road out of the valley was a single lane, gravel turning to cracked asphalt, running about 2 miles between fence line and forest, before it hit the county highway. Marin had driven it 100 times. She knew every pothole. She turned onto it going maybe 30, glancing in the mirror out of pure animal instinct. And that was when the 7th turn arrived. The one that took every fear she'd been quietly nursing for months and made it real in a way that stopped her breath in her chest. They were standing along both sides of the road. Not a crowd exactly. Not blocking anything. Nothing so crude as a barricade. They were simply there, spaced out along the fence lines and the shoulder like they'd been planted. Ruth, near the first bend, with her hands folded in front of her. Wade, 100 yards past that, leaning on a fence post, like he'd just happened to be out for a walk. Theo, further on, with 2 of the school children. Old Franklin, near the county line, sitting on an overturned bucket, like he'd been sitting there all morning. Every single person Marin had ever shared a meal with in 6 years, strung along the 2 miles of road she had to drive to get out. And every one of them was smiling. Every one of them lifted a hand as she passed. Some of them waved with both arms, big warm sweeping motions like she was leaving for vacation, like this was a parade thrown in her honor. Ruth actually blew her a kiss. Nobody stepped into the road. Nobody touched her truck. That was the part that would stay with Marin longest. Longer than the fear itself. How gentle it all looked. How much like love. A woman could drive past 100 smiling neighbors, waving her on her way, and if she hadn't found that letter, if she hadn't heard her sister crying 2,000 miles away, she might have believed it was nothing but a valley full of people who'd miss her. She kept her foot steady on the gas. She did not slow down, and she did not speed up, because either one felt like it would break something, would turn all that smiling into something else, and some animal part of her understood that the only way through this was to look like a woman who fully intended to come back with groceries. She lifted her hand off the wheel once, briefly, and waved back at Ruth, and Ruth's smile widened in a way that made Marin's stomach drop straight through the floor of the truck. The county highway came up faster than she remembered it ever coming, and when her tires hit the real asphalt, the wide black 2-lane road with actual traffic on it, actual strangers in actual cars who had never heard her name and never would, she did not look in the rearview mirror again. She drove 40 minutes to the county sheriff's office in Jackson County, with both hands locked on the wheel and her whole body shaking, and when she finally sat down across from a deputy who looked at her like she might be having some kind of episode, she understood that she was about to have to explain something that would sound, out loud, in a fluorescent-lit office, like the ravings of a woman who'd spent too long alone in the woods. It took the sheriff's department the better part of 2 years, working alongside county records and a Portland journalist who got interested after Marin's sister gave an interview, to even begin to map what the valley actually was. They found Colleen. They found 4 other names like Colleen's, going back 17 years. People who had moved into the Applegate Valley whole and gradually stopped existing anywhere else. No address changes, no forwarding mail, no goodbyes to family that hadn't been delivered secondhand by calm, pleasant strangers standing on a porch. 2 of the 4 they never found alive. Marin never went back for her things. She thinks about the road sometimes, though, more than she'd like to admit, the particular quality of all that waving, all that warmth, all those people who had genuinely, she came to believe, loved her, right up until the exact moment loving her stopped being different from owning her. She still can't watch anyone wave goodbye without feeling her stomach drop, without some old animal part of her bracing to see how many more of them are standing, just out of frame, smiling, and waiting to see which way she'll go. Marin Ostrander took the job because the pay was absurd for a security contractor with no hospitality background, and because the man who hired her, a developer named Colton Reyes, didn't ask a single question about her background check taking 3 extra days to clear. She needed the money. She needed to be somewhere that wasn't her apartment, where her ex-husband's things still sat in boxes she hadn't opened in 4 months. The Willamette State Hospital had been closed since 1998, sold twice, foreclosed once, and now it was being turned into a boutique hotel with exposed brick and reclaimed history as a selling point. Her job was simple: walk the property from 10 at night to 6 in the morning, log anything unusual, make sure the construction crew's equipment didn't grow legs. The building was 4 stories of Kirkbride-style brick, wings branching off a central spine like ribs, and half of it was still gutted down to the studs. She carried a flashlight, a radio, and a set of blueprints Colton had given her on a laminated sheet, the official floor plan the county had on file. 3 floors, plus a basement. That's what the paper said. That's what she was told to walk. The first week was boring, in the specific way that made her grateful. Pipes ticking as they cooled. Plastic sheeting, breathing in drafts she couldn't source. She got used to the particular smell of the place. Wet plaster, and something mineral underneath it. Like a coin, held too long in the mouth. She told herself the sounds were settling. Old buildings settle. She'd read that somewhere, and she repeated it to herself like a prayer. It was the 9th night when she first heard the footsteps. They came from directly above her, on the 2nd floor, in the east wing, where the drywall crew had already framed out what would become guest rooms. Even, unhurried steps, heel then toe, moving the length of the hallway and stopping. She stood at the bottom of the stairwell, with her flashlight aimed up into the dark, and told herself it was one of the framers. Forgot something, came back for a tool bag. She climbed up to check. Nobody there. Just tarps, zip-tied to exposed studs, moving slightly in air that shouldn't have been moving at all. She wrote it in her log as possible personnel, unconfirmed, and didn't sleep well that day. The footsteps came back the next night, and the next. Always the same wing, always after 2 a.m., always that same unhurried pace, like someone walking a hallway they'd walked 10,000 times before and had nowhere else to be. She started timing them. 14 steps, a pause, 14 steps back. She counted the door frames on the 2nd floor plan Colton had given her. 14 steps was almost exactly the distance between 2 door openings that, on the blueprint, weren't marked as rooms at all. They were marked as a single undivided space, storage. That was the first turning point, though she didn't understand it as one yet. She went back to the blueprint under better light, in her car, with the dome light on and a thermos of coffee she wasn't drinking so much as holding. The 2nd floor, east wing, was labeled clean and undivided on the paper Colton had given her, but the plaster lines on the actual walls upstairs told a different story. There were door frames bricked over, hinges still bolted into studs where doors used to hang. Someone had taken a floor full of rooms and, at some point after these blueprints were drawn, erased them from the official record while leaving the bones of them standing in the dark. She asked Colton about it over coffee in the trailer he used as a site office. He got cagey in a way developers don't usually get about zoning trivia. Said the 2nd floor had been reconfigured sometime in the 70s. Said he didn't have older records. That the county archive had lost a lot of the hospital's original documentation in a fire in 1981. He said it fast, the way people say things they've said before to other people who ask the same question. She let it go, because she needed the job, but she started sleeping with her phone's flashlight app already open, thumb on the button, which was its own kind of admission. The second turning point came from a woman named Ruth Calloway, who Marin found not through the hospital records but through a Facebook group for former state employees, a group with 9 members and 1 active poster. Ruth had worked in hospital administration from 1969 to 1981. Marin messaged her on a whim one afternoon, expecting nothing, and got a phone call back within the hour, which told her more than anything Ruth actually said in the first 5 minutes. Ruth's voice had the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed staying calm about a subject for 40 years. There had been a 3rd floor, Ruth said, not the 2nd floor Marin was asking about, a floor above it, a locked ward for what the hospital called at the time chronic and violent patients, the kind of population a 1970s state facility didn't spend money keeping comfortable. In March of 1974, 3 patients died in that ward within 11 days of each other. Officially, one by cardiac arrest, one by what the paperwork called self-inflicted injury, and one, Ruth's voice changed here, went flatter, unexplained. The state investigated, found nothing they were willing to put in writing, and the ward was closed within the year. Reclassified, Ruth said, merged administratively into the second floor's records so it would stop showing up as its own line item on state audits. On paper, the third floor simply stopped existing sometime around 1975. In the actual building, the stairwell leading up to it was bricked over in 1996, right before the whole hospital shut down for good. Maren sat with the phone against her ear for a long time, after Ruth hung up, doing math she didn't want to do. The footsteps she'd been hearing weren't on the second floor at all. They were coming from directly above the second floor, from a floor that, according to every document Colton Reyes had shown her, had been demolished during a 1996 gut renovation that never actually happened, because the hospital closed 2 years later, and the renovation was abandoned mid-permit. That was the third turning point, and it was the one that sent her back into the building during daylight hours, with a crowbar and a headlamp and a resolve that felt less like curiosity and more like something she owed somebody. She found the bricked stairwell exactly where the old fire escape plans, the real ones, the ones Ruth had mailed her in a manila envelope with actual stamps on it, said it would be. Someone had drywalled over the brick sometime later to make it disappear even further. A wall behind a door that had never been on any modern blueprint. It took her 40 minutes with the crowbar to open a gap wide enough to fit through. The stairwell went up into dark that her headlamp didn't seem to fully cut through, the way a flashlight beam looks thin and useless in a room bigger than you expected. At the top there was a door, unlocked, and beyond it a hallway that matched nothing on Colton's blueprints, because Colton's blueprints insisted this hallway had been rubble for 3 decades. The floor was intact. Water damage, yes. Ceiling tiles down in places, but intact. An entire ward, 12 rooms, a nurse's station with a rotary phone, still sitting on the desk under a 1/4 inch of undisturbed dust, except for a clean rectangle in that dust, exactly the size of a hand, like something had been picked up and set back down, over and over, for years. She didn't go further than the nurse's station that day. She went back to her car and sat with the doors locked until the sun came up properly, and she told herself she was going to quit, and she told Colton that on the phone the next morning, and Colton did something that became the 4th turning point. He offered her triple her rate to stay through the end of the renovation, cash under the table, no paperwork. And when she pushed back and asked why a hotel developer would pay that much to keep one overnight guard quiet about a floor that legally didn't exist, he told her the truth, or a version close enough to it that his voice shook telling it. The renovation permits had been fast-tracked through a county official who also happened to be the grandson of the hospital's former administrator, the same administrator who signed off on reclassifying the ward's death records in 1974. Colton had known about the 3rd floor since before he bought the property. It was part of why the land was cheap. He was betting that sealing it up tighter and building a boutique hotel with a good story about old asylum charm over the top of it would be enough. He needed her to keep walking the halls and reporting nothing so the construction insurance wouldn't flag unusual structural findings that would trigger a new historical review and freeze the entire project for years. She should have quit right there. She thought about quitting for 3 full days, working double-checking her lease, her savings, the boxes still in her apartment. She went back for one more night, she told herself, just to get her final gear off the property. And that was the 5th turning point, the one that undid everything she thought she understood about what had been happening to her. She went up to the 3rd floor with a real flashlight this time, and a phone recording video, thinking evidence, thinking proof, thinking she could take this to a reporter or the State Historical Society and blow the whole renovation open before anyone else set foot in that hotel. She walked the hallway counting doors, and at the 7th one she found a room that had clearly been used recently, not decades ago. Recently. A sleeping bag, food wrappers with expiration dates from that year, a battery lantern, charged. Someone had been living up there, not a ghost. Not footsteps with no source. A person. And when Marin turned to leave, the person was standing in the doorway behind her, and it wasn't a stranger. It was Ruth Calloway's son, a man named Denny, who Ruth had mentioned once, briefly, as someone who'd had troubles, who Marin later learned had been quietly returning to this floor for 6 years, ever since being released from a psychiatric hold that almost sent him to a state facility that no longer existed, because the one he'd have gone to was this one. And some tangled, broken part of him had come back to the only building that had ever, in his mind, kept him safe from himself, sleeping in a ward that the state, the county, and a developer with a fast-tracked permit had all agreed, on paper, was gone. The footsteps were his. The clean rectangle in the dust was his lantern base, set down and picked up every night for years. There was no ghost walking a hallway that didn't exist. There was a man the system had lost twice. Once when the ward officially disappeared in 1974, and once when nobody thought to check whether demolished was actually true, before a construction crew started framing walls 2 floors below him. What happened after wasn't clean. Denny didn't want to leave, and it took 2 days. A crisis counselor Ruth insisted on calling personally, and a decision from Marin not to tell Colton anything until Denny was somewhere safe, before the floor was empty of anyone living. The hotel opened 7 months later with a plaque in the lobby about honoring the building's complex history, which mentioned nothing about the ward, the deaths in 1974, or the man who'd spent 6 years walking its halls alone in the dark, keeping better time than anyone else in that building ever had.